Sixth grade. This is a really infamous school year that everyone dreaded, since it's of course the first year of middle school. However, that's not what this story time is about, as I did not go to middle school for 6th grade. Instead, I had an even more horrifying experience with change and transferring and all that stuff for 6th grade, which I did at an intermediate school. So for part 2 of the extensive reflection project, I thought that I'd go over my 6th grade school year, what it all entailed, and how I managed through my second hardest school year. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 53, on July 7th, 2023. So before I begin, I want to remind y'all that this is part 2 in an 8-part series I'm doing where I reflect over my school years. In the last part, which was of course part 1, I combined all of my elementary school years and talked about preschool to 5th grade. If you haven't seen it, then I would highly recommend watching it first so that you are not completely lost in the story time. So, firstly, let's go over the backstory. So for preschool to 5th grade, I attended an elementary school about 5 minutes from where I lived. My first few years here were as difficult, particularly my 3rd grade school year, but my 4th and 5th grade school years would prove to be really good, with me becoming popular and basically dominating the school. However, the middle school that my elementary school was funneled into was not only 25 minutes away from where I lived, but it was in a completely opposite direction from where my parents worked. Therefore, they transferred me to an intermediate school that was not only closer to where we lived, but also closer to where they worked. Now, while 6th grade is already a scary school year for most people since it's their first year of middle school, for me, this was an even scarier experience. The reason is because rather than being scared with everyone else, I was the only one dealing with this transition, since everyone else had already been to the school for 5th grade. Additionally, I was also the only one without his group, since everyone already made their friends back in 5th grade and I had to find my group. Like, with middle school, at least you already know some people from elementary school, so it isn't that bad, but for me, this was brutal. On top of that, I did not make new friends easily. I explained why as well as why I didn't make my first friend until I was 9 years old in part 1, so watch it if you want to know why. Now, Mom knew what was going on in the whole transition, so throughout the summer, she had me take part in quite a few activities to meet other boys my age who went to church. I'm not sure why she wanted me to specifically find someone who specifically went to church. But I get that we're religious, but despite growing up in church, I never really got along with anyone in church. I've never really been able to relate to anyone in church and have always been an outcast. In fact, as a kid, most of my friends did not go to church regularly, and that's still the case with most of my friends now as an adult. So choosing this characteristic was one of the worst ones that she could have chose. However, I did not have a choice in these, as while I wanted to stay home and rest up before the inevitable second hardest school year ever, she forced me to attend 3 VBSs and a church camp. So let's talk about these as well as how summer of 2015 went for me overall. Alright, so I did one for VBS in June, the other 2 in July, and the camp the week after the 3rd VBS, so I was stocked up with things to do. Now, for those who have not seen part 1, VBS stands for Vacation Bible School. It's a program that many churches across the nation host during a week of summer where kids from rising 1st graders to rising 6th graders learn about God and some Bible stories while also interacting with others their age. It's a really good program for kids to learn about God and understand His Word better. However, determining whether or not your kids will enjoy it is the issue. Generally, your energetic and extroverted kids tend to love VBS while your more reserved and introverted kids hate it. I hated VBS as a kid because although I was really energetic, I was still a very introverted kid. And now as an adult, I'm even more introverted and have no energy. So if I did VBS today, I'd probably hate it even more. Anyways, I've never really liked how loud VBS was and how crowded it was, as I'm very sensitive to loud and crowded environments. But I had to do VBS every year since kindergarten, so I kind of sucked it up and went through it. But this year things were different, as I had to do 3 VBSs since of course Mom wanted me to meet other boys my age who also went to church. These 3 VBSs were of course done with 3 different churches, all 3 of whom had different ways of doing VBS. The first VBS I did this summer was with the church I went to prior to finding myself disliking church. I'll talk more on why I began hating church in part 5, but all you really need to know is that for this story time is that I never had been to this church prior to this VBS. However, this church was located in the school district I was transferring to. On top of that, a good majority of kids here were enrolled in public school, contrary to my church at the time where me and my sister Zoe were the only members in public school. Therefore, it was a good opportunity to meet people I would be going to school with, even if I wouldn't see them again for another 2 years since I didn't have any classes with them. Anyways, if you've seen part 1, then you probably know that VBS is a very structured event that lasts Monday through Thursday, with an additional special session on Thursday night where our parents join us. However, this church did things differently, as their VBS was Monday through Friday, which I hated since I of course did not like VBS, so having to endure another day of noise and crowding was going to be dreadful. Another thing, too, is that this church modeled their VBSs after the school district it was in. So as mentioned, this school district has an intermediate school, so rather than having VBS run from kindergarten to 5th grade, this church ran from VBS for kindergarten to 6th grade. Additionally, they also made it so that youth was for 7th to 12th grade as opposed to making it 6th to 12th grade like most other churches, since a good majority of kids went to public school. Anyways, the first day of VBS was Monday, June 22nd, 2015, the day after my 11th birthday. So I got up that morning and Mom drove me to church, signed me up, and then I was placed in Group 5B, the second of the 5th grade groups. It wouldn't be until Wednesday when I actually began talking to someone, so at this point, I was just by myself and didn't bother with anyone. Anyways, once time was up, we went into the sanctuary to have the morning celebrations, or big-ass sessions as I'll refer to them as. But before we get into them and all the youth members were volunteering, lined up, high-fived everyone, and made tons of noise. Now, I talked a little bit about my autism diagnosis in part 1, so I've already explained why I hate these kinds of environments. But for those who haven't seen part 1, basically, one condition of my disability is that I am unusually sensitive to loud environments. Like, whenever I walk into a grocery store or another loud area with a lot of people, I wear noise-canceling AirPods to keep myself calm and not get nervous. Therefore, you can kind of get a glimpse of how I was feeling during this time. So while all the youth members were high-fiving us and yelling good morning, I had my hands covering my ears and I didn't go for any high fives. Nowadays, although I'm still just as sensitive to loud environments as I was as a kid, I'm a lot better at controlling myself and acting more like a neurotypical in environments like this. Although I still use the AirPods since they make navigating these environments much easier. Anyways, the big-ass session wasn't anything too special. The preacher introduced us to VBS, and then he passed the mic to the discipleship pastor, who guided us through saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, Christian flag, and the Bible. Afterwards, some of the youth volunteers got on stage and guided us through the theme song of VBS, which is basically a song about going on a journey off the mat and connecting it to God. That's what every VBS theme song does, since they're mostly connected to the theme rather than being exclusively Christian songs. Now, while these songs were pretty annoying, they weren't that bad on their own. What made them horrible were those damn dances that came along with them. You'll come to know that I hate dancing just as much as I hate singing, so being forced to do these was just the worst. When I became a youth volunteer 4 years later, which I'll touch on in part 6, I made it very clear with the kids that I was working with that they were not forced to do any of this stuff. And that made me very popular with the kids since none of the kids wanted to do this shit. Anyways, after we did our theme song, we got to sit down and watch a 5-minute clip. So every day during our big-ass session, we got to watch a 5-part video series specifically made for VBS. The plot is very straightforward. The main character, a child or a group of children, have a problem, usually a bad guy, that they face. In the last episode, they realize that if they trust God, then things will be good. So they do that and voila, the problem has been fixed, and the bad guy has turned into a good one. Very easy and simple plot, which is actually quite necessary since if you give these a complex plot, the kindergartners aren't gonna have a clue what's going on. I don't remember what this one in particular was about, but I remember it involved a girl trying to find her dad in the wilderness or something like that. And after that, we were dismissed to our lesson. So unlike where I did VBS before, this church also did something different here regarding lessons. So instead of having a particular station to be set as the lesson, each group had their own classroom and the group leader would teach the lesson. Therefore, the group leader had a much more significant role here than the other church where they were simply chaperones. Anyways, like most other church events, I do not remember any lessons from this VBS or any VBS except for one, and I'll explain why I remember it when we get to the second VBS I'll be discussing in Storytime. Now, while this wasn't my least favorite part of VBS, as I really despise both the big-ass sessions and music, this was probably the most boring part of the day, since they really felt just like school, particularly an English lesson since I hated English. It also didn't help much that my group leader wasn't a teacher, so I pretty much zoned out during each of these. Then after that, we can move on to the more enjoyable parts about VBS. To start, let's talk about crafts. So crafts are pretty straightforward. The leaders over crafts design a craft that correlates with the theme of the lesson, show you how to do it, and then you do it on your own. As an example, one craft we did was a lizard bead, since the theme of course was the wilderness. After crafts came rec. These are also pretty self-explanatory, as these were pretty much just us playing games, usually against the other class. So of course being in 5B, we often competed against 5A during these games. They usually didn't do the go with the theme, since they were just fun little games to give attendance some exercise. Now, rec can be pretty tiring, since with this church, it was done outside in North Carolina summers, which can sometimes be pretty brutal. So it was always nice to cool down and go to our next station, being music. Now, music was my least favorite station. Other than cooling down from rec, I hated everything about it, since it was basically the same deal as the big ass sessions, but this time, we were learning new songs and the dance motions to them. But thankfully, music at this church was much more bearable than the church I'd been doing VBS with the past few years. The lady over it was really rude and often condescending of students not trying. Meanwhile, at this church, the guy who ran music here was really cool and didn't mind if we didn't want to do it. In fact, even if we didn't even try, he was still very encouraging and overall was a lot more understanding. So while it was still my least favorite station and part of VBS, music was at least a lot better here than the other church. At least after enduring my least favorite station, we went to my favorite station, snacks. Snacks were usually very simple packaged stuff like Little Debbie cakes, but sometimes they would fix popcorn. So yeah, snacks were great. Then after that, it was time to leave. Now, like most VBSs, I do not have a whole lot of memory about everything that happened here. I of course remember the dances, songs, and how obnoxiously loud the big ass sessions were, but I do not have a ton of memory about them. However, I do remember making a friend that Wednesday, so some kid sat beside me and struck up a conversation. We talked to him pretty soon, we became friends. However, the only issue is that he was going to a school in a different school district, so we would not see each other again. He was also the only one I talked to this week, so this week was a failure, it sucked, and was a waste of my time. Okay, well, I think I might have took that a little too far. While the week was a failure in terms of what Mom wanted to see happen and was a little bit of a waste, it wasn't terrible. In fact, this was probably the best VBS I had attended up to that point. I didn't enjoy it and would have much rather stayed home, but it was actually not that bad, as this church ran VBS way better than the other church, which is ironic because the same people who ran VBS also ran Fuge, which was one of the most disorganized events ever, but that's 2018, we're only in 2015, so let's stay here. Anyways, let's skip over to early July, which was the second of the 3 VBSs that I attended. So this VBS was with the church that I had been doing VBS since kindergarten, as well as the church I attended until August 2014 when they created a satellite church closer to where we live. So if you've seen part 1, this VBS pretty much worked exactly how those worked. But if you haven't, basically, VBS with this church was only a Monday through Thursday event, with Thursday night having a special extra session where our parents came. Additionally, lessons were treated just like the other stations, so our group leader was just a chaperone, not an actual teacher. Now as for why Mom signed me up for this one, I have absolutely no clue. This church was 35 minutes away, and nobody I would be going to school with would be going to this VBS, so I'm not sure why I had to do this one. However, there was something good that came out of it that put an end to an almost 6-year-long conflict I had with a group of boys that had been physically bullying me and picking on me since kindergarten, which I'll touch on later. But for part 1ers, y'all right remember them as the dipshits, so I'll refer to them as for the story time as well. Now, for the previous few years, this church had made at least one new rule for each VBS. In 2013, they made the older kids and younger kids have separate VBSs. Then in 2014, they made it so that each group did things together. VBS 2015 also added an additional rule, with this one making the groups gender segregated. So instead of randomly splitting groups into Group A or Group B, each group had a group for the boys, and each grade had a group for the boys and a group for the girls. In part 1, I talked about my issue with gender-segregated events, since that made it 100% certain that the dipshits would harass and bully me. However, we'll see that something happened that caused me to not share a group with the dipshits. So that's what the new rule was. However, this VBS was also different compared to previous years because I wasn't going here alongside Mom's business. So my mom used to own a competitive cheerleading business when I was a kid. She also operated a summer camp over the summer, but roughly a month prior to this VBS, she closed her business down and decided to pursue a career in teaching, which is how she ended up as a 5th grade math teacher. Therefore, rather than taking all the summer camp kids and me to VBS, she just directly took me and Zoe here, making getting here a lot more direct and simple. That's also how she was able to spend a lot more time with us this summer, since she did not work this summer. Anyways, this VBS lasted from July 6th to July 9th, so back to being only a 4-day program. So on the 6th, Mom of course took me and Zoe to this church and got us signed up. However, I don't know if Mom made a mistake or if the 5th grade boys group was full, as I was actually placed in the 4th grade boys group. No idea how this happened, but I sure in hell was not complaining one bit. In fact, I didn't even tell them that it was a mistake, because if I did, then I might be placed in the 5th grade boys group and have to deal with the dipshits. And plus, I didn't have any friends at church anyways, so I wasn't missing out on hanging out with anyone either. Therefore, this was a huge win. And the best part was that despite being a year older than everyone, I was treated very well amongst the group, even making a friend on the first day. I believe his name was Brandon, although I don't remember exactly, but we'll just call him Brandon. Anyways, Brandon really liked Bloons Tower Defense, a game I was into, so we talked a lot about what strategies we like using, as well as comparing Bloons Monkey City bases and just talking about the series overall. So yeah, I made a friend on the first day. The others also treated me well too, kinda like my classroom when I was in 4th grade. Ah, those good old days of playing soccer with them at recess. Man, those were good times. Anyways, let's touch on the theme before I get to the stations. So not every church uses the same theme. While the church I did VBS with back in June did Journey Off the Map, this church did a Mount Everest-based theme. I forgot the theme's actual name, so I'll just call it Mount Everest since that's what we talked about. So now the big ass session. Just like they always are, this big ass session was obnoxious and irritating. But after it, things got better since the stations were the same deal as the previous church. Just that rec was indoors and music was done with that woman who didn't have a lot of patience. But then we got to snacks and see probably the biggest highlight from VBS, as well as what made it even better. So how snacks worked was that every boys group would eat snacks together, and of course each girls group did the same thing. This meant that the 3rd and fellow 5th grade boys were also eating snacks with us. This was an issue, as now the dipshits had somewhere to bully me. And that's what they did. Brandon had to use the bathroom, so he couldn't defend me when those dipshits came. They of course did the typical, they hit and kicked me. But then, a miracle I had been waiting for almost 6 years had finally happened. A woman, who I think was the group leader for the 3rd grade boys, saw what was going on, so she ran over and immediately demanded that those dipshits get off of me. They did, as while the woman didn't raise her voice at them, those two were completely terrified. Like, I kid you not, one of them even had tears in his eyes. You could tell that these two had never been told no before. But now that they had been scolded, they got off of me and ran away as they were told. The woman then talked with me some and made sure I was alright. Throughout the rest of the week, she would pay attention to me in snacks to make sure that the dipshits weren't doing anything. She would also check up on me daily to make sure I was okay and wasn't being messed with. So yeah, this woman unknowingly ended a 6-year-long conflict. Although to be fair, if it wasn't for VBS, this conflict would have probably ended since we stopped going to Awana's every Wednesday night earlier that year, and I therefore had not seen these two dipshits since February. But nonetheless, it was still very nice to have a formal end to it, especially since it had been raging on for more than half the time I had even been alive up to that point. As for the rest of the week, nothing really happened. Brandon stopped going that Wednesday, but the group was at least still really cool and I got along with them, so it wasn't the worst thing in the world. However, staying on Wednesday, let's talk about an interesting lesson from VBS that is also the only VBS lesson I still remember. So we were learning about the story about Naaman and Elisha. It comes from 2 Kings chapter 5 in case you're interested in reading it for yourself. Anyways, Naaman was a military general for what is now modern-day Syria. However, Naaman was really pissed off at God because he ended up getting leprosy, which was a disease that was pretty much like the COVID-19 of Bible times. So Elisha, a prophet, tells Naaman, "Damn, you're a hideous little shit. Go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Maybe that'll do the trick." So Naaman does that, and what do you know? His leprosy has been healed. Now, what I want to focus on in particular with the story is that Naaman was a military general. So to emphasize what he did, the teacher kicked down some paper boxes and told the class to rebuild it, and then kicked it down again saying it wasn't good enough. However, she wasn't really intimidating, and although it was a good demonstration, it could have been a little bit better. However, in the 3rd VBS I attended, we'll see the same lesson taught way better, and I'll explain what happens when we get there. And then that Thursday night, we had the additional session. Mom and Dad both attended since it took place after Dad got off of work. And yeah, we wrapped up my last VBS with this church. It was definitely the best one I did at this church, and although I still didn't really enjoy it since it was so loud and crowded, I did enjoy meeting Brandon and resolving the conflict with the dipshits. Now if we skip over to the next week, we'll see the very last VBS I attended. Now, this VBS was with the church I was going to at the time, so the satellite church of the previous church. However, there was one issue. Our church was way too small to host a VBS. Like, me and Zoe were the only ones of our grade, since 70% of the congregation was over the age of 65. But the church still wanted to be like all the other churches and host VBS. So they teamed up with another church that was, while much larger than our church, it was still pretty small compared to the other 2 churches I discussed in the story time. So small that each grade consisted of only 1 group, and each group only had about 8 kids, so this is not a large VBS. Now, this VBS worked much differently than the others, as expected of a different church. One thing is that this church did not base VBS off a school district, since most of these kids are homeschooled. Therefore, VBS was only hosted for kindergarten to 5th grade, meaning I was amongst the oldest attendants like I was at the previous VBS. But what made this VBS far more different than any other VBS I had attended was that it took place from Sunday to Thursday. Now, VBS is usually held during the morning, so how did they run this on Sunday when of course that was the worship service? Well, they decided to host VBS at night. VBS ran from 6 to 8:30, which was the perfect time for VBS to be held. Not only was it not as hot outside, but more adult volunteers could help since it occurred past working hours. Therefore, this VBS was done as a family, as while me and Zoe of course attended it, Mom worked rec, my grandmother worked crafts, and Dad worked security. So for the first time, VBS was now a family event. Oh, and just to make things even better, this was also the quietest VBS I attended. Of course, because there were not as many kids, they couldn't make much noise. So rather than big-ass sessions being super loud and super hype, the big-ass sessions for this VBS were a lot quieter and the volume was much more on par with the usual worship service. This was incredibly smooth to my ears, and I never had to cover them up at all. Now, being the satellite church, we did VBS almost the same way the main church did, so we still used Mount Everest as our theme, although we chose to do a couple different songs since I believe that the company over VBS also has some more calmer and relaxed songs dedicated to smaller churches like ours, but otherwise, it was pretty much the same stuff. Anyways, there's not really much to talk about until I get to Tuesday. So Tuesday for our lesson, we did that name and story that I told y'all earlier. However, the teacher for lessons here had a different approach for describing how Naaman did things. Instead of having us build a fort and kicking it down, the teacher yelled at the top of his lungs some of the orders as if he was an actual drill sergeant. This terrified all of us, but once he began laughing, we all began laughing with him. I'm sure he would have not been able to do this with the younger kids, otherwise some parents would have been berating this dude. But since we're older, we found it funny and was actually what made this the only VBS lesson I still remember. So yeah, it was both funny and helped me remember it. And then after that, I don't really remember much. However, I can say that this officially became the first and only VBS I've ever been to that I could say that I enjoyed. I love this VBS because it was so much more relaxed, so much more quiet, and so much less crowded. And just to top it off, it was at night as well, which I really like since I've always been a night owl. So yeah, this was an awesome VBS. I wish the other VBSs were like this. And to any parents watching this, if you know your child is an introvert or is sensitive to loud environments and you want to enroll them in VBS, I recommend doing it with a smaller church, as I enjoyed one with a smaller church way better than the ones with the big churches. So yeah, that's the last VBS I ever participated in as an attendant, as I would actually volunteer as a youth helper for VBS 2016, 2019, and 2021, which I'll touch on parts 3, 6, and 8 respectively. I also volunteered in 2022, but I'm not going to discuss that in this series because this took place after I graduated high school. But in a couple years, if I choose to do a series like this for college, I'll talk about that VBS when I discuss my second semester. Anyways, while I was now finally done with VBSs, I still had one more church thing to do this summer, that being church camp. So Mom was good friends with the woman who had a boy about my age. The church that they went to offered a church camp for rising 4th to rising 7th graders, and her son had been going to there since he was a rising 4th grader and was going again this year. So Mom had the idea of sending me off to camp with this kid, since there would be some other boys who were going to my future school. So without hesitation, she signed me up. Now when she told me that she signed me up, I was not excited one bit, as not only would I be away from home for 5 days and 4 nights, but I would not get any privacy and would constantly be around other boys the entire time. So I begged and begged and begged Mom not to force me to go, but she wouldn't oblige, saying she loved camp as a kid and that I would meet so many people. Therefore, I had to go here, where I would have a worse experience than any VBS I ever attended. Anyways, before I get into the details about camp, I want to discuss the 2 different types of kids regarding camp. I bring this up every time I talk about camp because overnight camp attendants either really love camp or they really hate it. There's no real in between. On top of that, science can be used to distinguish 2 groups since they usually are much different psychologically and sociologically. So, the first type of campers are your camp lovers. These kids often go away for an entire summer and attend every summer they can. They are usually your very extroverted and energetic kids and are usually members of very religious families and are very involved with the church. On the other hand are your camp haters. These kids only go to camp because their parents forced them to go, and unexpectedly, they end up really hating camp. These kids are usually a lot more introverted, not as involved in church, and their families usually are not as religious as camp lovers. Now, it should come to no surprise that I fall under the camp hater category, since I fit into all those fields. I'm a big introvert, I was forced to go to camp, I wasn't really ever involved a ton in church, and I've never been as religious as most camp lovers. Meanwhile, Mom, who is just as extroverted as I am introverted, went to camp every summer, was very involved with church as a kid, grew up in a very religious family, would be classified as a camp lover. Now, of course, there can be exceptions, as some introverted kids love camp, and I'll even admit that there were a few times when camp was fun. However, these characteristics have very high levels of correlations, so that's why I used them to classify camp lovers and camp haters. Alright, so let's talk about camp itself. So if you've seen Storytime 41, which was about my experience at camp, you might recall that after camp, I tried to forget that I went here. And I was successful, as I forgot most stuff that happened until I came across a Reddit post in July of 2021 about camp, which pretty much returned a lot of memories from camp. So that's why my mind has always been kind of fuzzy regarding camp. But after writing story times for over 2 years, I've kind of understood better about camp, and now I remember most things that happened. However, there are 2 main details I do not remember: the name of the camp and where it took place. I did a shit ton of research trying to find the camp name and location, even looking on the church's website, but I just couldn't find any information on it, so I just referred to this place as camp rather than the actual name of the place. However, I do believe that the camp is located somewhere in upstate South Carolina, as I recall a pretty funny story that happened on I-485 that I'll get to in a bit. On top of that, I remember the ride to and back not being that long, and considering I live in Charlotte, more specifically like 20 minutes from the South Carolina state line, saying that this took place in upstate South Carolina is a pretty reasonable guess, so we'll say that that's where this camp took place. Anyways, the camp lasted from Sunday, July 19th to Thursday, July 23rd. Thankfully not a whole week, but still a brutal stretch of time, especially since I had never been away from my parents for that long. In fact, prior to starting college, the only time I was away from my parents for more than 3 days was Fuge, which of course was 3 years after camp. So yeah, this is going to be very challenging, and it was damn well was. Anyways, that Sunday after church, Mom and Dad drove me over to this church and dropped me off. Most boys had already arrived, since most of them simply walked from the worship service or Sunday school over to the van, as they of course went to this church. So I got my suitcase loaded in the back of the van and then took a seat near the back since all the other seats were taken. I was also sitting by myself, which I didn't really mind since I did not feel like talking to anyone, as I was both pretty pissed off that Mom and Dad were sending me off, as well as scared about what this week would entail. It's also pretty difficult to even talk to anyone, since everyone was already close with each other, and since I was the only one not a member of the church, I was pretty much the outcast. So how the van worked was that I was actually going to this place with everyone in my cabin, including the group leader who was driving the van. Therefore, all of these people who were in the van were also going to be the people I would be living with for the next few days. And to be fair, they were all really cool and very nice, all except for one, which I'll get to later. Now, even though I spent the good majority of this ride looking out the window, there was a really funny moment that dealt with this kid named Aiden. So Aiden was a rising 5th grader who also happened to be the group's leader's son, which makes this even better. So we just merged onto I-485, so this was roughly about the halfway point in our trip. Anyways, the group leader wanted to hand everyone a water bottle as a refreshment, so we got Aiden, who was in the passenger seat beside him, to pass everyone water bottles. So of course Aiden did that, and all's well, right? Well, not exactly. So Aiden was a little bit clumsy that day and ended up spilling his water bottle. We all laughed, including our group leader since accidents happen, so we handed Aiden some napkins and Aiden got it cleaned up. But it gets even better when you hear what Aiden did with his now empty water bottle. While he should have just kept hold of his water bottle for the rest of the trip, Aiden wanted to discard it immediately. So he rolled down his window and literally threw his water bottle outside. That's already bad enough since that's harmful to the environment. But to make things even worse, Aiden's water bottle hit the car beside us. Thankfully, that car didn't swerve or wreck or anything like that, so we all began crying laughing while our group leader shouted, "Aiden!" in not necessarily an angry tone, but more of a surprised tone. In fact, the fact that Aiden also casually did this in front of his dad was also really funny. Like, if this was me and my dad, he would have pulled me over and beat my ass in a heartbeat. But after that, things calmed down. The boys kept chatting while I continued staring at the window, but after a little while, we reached a camp, so let's get into it. So we got our camp stuff unloaded from the van, and then our group leader unlocked our cabin. The cabin was a very small one-room building with 11 bunk beds, which was perfect since there were 22 of us, including the group leader, so that meant that we weren't having another Fuge situation occur. However, we still had to pick a bunk and a bunkmate. If you saw Storytime 49, then y'all know how difficult it is for me to find a buddy. I emphasized this quite a bit when I talked about Fuge and Winter Retreat 2019, and I'll talk about both of these events in part 5. Anyways, a little bit of time went on, and I still had yet to find a bunkmate. But thankfully, there was another kid who did not have a bunkmate, so we both agreed to be bunkmates. However, that's when the son of Mom's friend came over and gave me a little bit of advice regarding this kid. So this was a weird-ass kid. He was a rising 5th grader known for talking a lot of inappropriate things. Additionally, he was also a bedwetter. I thanked him for the advice and told my bunkmate that I was taking a top bunk, which he was cool with. And as we'll see in a bit, this advice saved me big time. I'll refer to the son of Mom's friend as the advisor since he would give me quite a bit of advice throughout the week, while I'll refer to my bunkmate as the weird kid. So that was that. Once we got settled, we were ordered to put our swimsuits on and head over to the pool, as we were going to do the swim test to determine whether or not we could swim in the deep end. Now, I used to be a competitive swimmer. However, it wouldn't be until a year later when I started swimming competitively, which I'll touch on at the end of the story time. But I knew how to swim, so that wouldn't be an issue. But there was an issue, that issue being putting on my swimsuit. So I was late putting mine on, as instead of getting naked in front of everyone in the cabin, I chose to go over to the bathhouse and change in a stall because I ain't gay. By the way, Christian camps are by far some of the gayest places ever. These places put pride festivals to shame. Like, I didn't know what being gay was or that people could be attracted to the same gender at the time, but I still felt like I was the only camper attracted to girls. While this wasn't a single-sex camp, this place was a massive sausage fest, and there were only one time per day I even saw girls. So I guess that kind of makes sense why people go gay for the stay. Wait, did mom send me to a church camp or a prison? I don't even know at this point. There's very little difference between the two. Anyways, when I got back to the cabin after changing, everyone was already gone to the pool. I had no idea where the pool was, so I got pretty upset and just changed back into my normal clothes and then laid on my bed wishing I was back home. But a little while later, the advisor returned. He had already finished the swim test and even had already dried off and put his dry clothes on. We talked for a little bit until the rest of the group came. Shortly afterwards, the rest of the group came back in and we all collectively went to the cafeteria to eat dinner since by then, it was already 5 o'clock. I don't remember what we ate, so I can't make comments about the food. But after dinner, were led to this big conference building. It actually looked pretty small on the outside, but on the inside, this thing was massive. Like, it had a huge stage and was just overall big. Anyways, this conference building is where we had our big ass sessions. So big ass sessions work very similarly here as they did during VBS. They were obnoxiously loud, and because all electronics, including headphones, were not allowed, I couldn't distract myself from the noise, making this an absolutely dreadful experience. But once they began, the camp director made announcements and welcomed us to camp. He also went over our theme and some housekeeping stuff, which I don't remember, so I won't talk about these. But then we did what I hated most from VBS, singing and dancing. So like how VBS had songs made for the program, this camp had the same thing. Some counselors got up on stage, showed us how to do the dance motions to the theme song, and then of course we as a camp sang and danced to the songs. Well, most of us. Neither me nor anyone in our group did any dancing or singing. Our group leader tried to get us to join in, but none of us would bother, so we gave up. Anyways, after that chaos, another director who was also a preacher at a nearby church that funded this camp took the stage and gave a sermon. And just like with VBS's, I do not remember any of the lessons from camp. In fact, with the exception of that one story about Naaman, as well as a lesson we learned in D Now 2021, which I'll touch on in part 7, I do not remember any lessons from any of the church trips I attended, which makes sense as it's a lot easier to remember hearing a kid screaming a bad word in the shower than it is to remember some random story from the book of Zephaniah or some other lesser read book of the Bible. I'll talk more about that kid screaming later, as that did actually happen. So, once the preacher was done with his sermon, we then all split up with our groups and had group discussions about the sermon, and our group leader asked us some discussion questions. I don't remember anything that happened during these, so we can skip over to after the big ass session. So once the big ass session ended, we were free to do whatever until 9 o'clock, which is when we had to be back in our cabins for lights out, which to me that made no sense. Not only is 9 o'clock really early, but we had literally no way of checking the time, since we of course were not allowed electronics on this trip. And by electronics, that meant not only no phones or headphones, but also no watches, which also did not make much sense to me. Therefore, the general rule was that whenever you saw a bunch of people walking to their cabins, then you should do the same. Anyways, I hung out with the advisor. He showed me how to play a game called Carpet Ball, which was pretty big at this camp. So basically, in Carpet Ball, you are at one end of a thin corridor with your opponent is at the other end. You each have 4 pool balls. Using a white pool ball, your goal is to knock your opponent's balls off. There's a lot of strategy in this game, particularly with how you set your balls and which ones you choose to take on first. This is a really good game for me to get into since I was really big into strategy video games during this time, aka Bloons Tower Defense. Therefore, pretty much immediately after the advisor taught me how to play this game, I got pretty good since I was able to formulate strategies and learn from every match I played against him. I learned the advisor's technique and analyzed his strengths and weaknesses with every game I played against him, and pretty soon, I was beating him every time, even without him holding back. I also developed my own strategy regarding the placement of balls. I don't remember the exact formation I used, but I do remember that it involved using a dummy ball that baited my opponent into focusing on it rather than my others. By focusing their attention on this ball, my opponent would waste turns while I quickly took care of theirs. We'll see how this strategy led to me becoming a carpet ball legend later on. Anyways, After continually losing to me, the advisor got bored and invited me to sit with Aiden, who was enjoying a Diet Coke by the snack bar. Mom gave me some money to spend on snacks, so I spent a little bit on money on Coke and Skittles and hung out with Aiden. Aiden asked me about my situation since he had never seen me, so I explained to him what was going on. He completely understood and offered to give me some advice since this was his second year at camp, which I greatly appreciated. Anyways, his first piece of advice dealt with the showers. So he said that his dad, or our group leader, required us to take a shower every day, which I completely understand, as we were all hanging out outside all day and sweating. However, Aiden advised me that it would be best to take a shower in the morning because it's less crowded than at night. He even offered to wake me up early every morning so I could take a shower, which I took his offer on. So every morning, he would wake me up early so I would take a shower. He also talked about some other stuff that I do not remember. But after a while, we noticed some people were walking to their cabins, so we decided to do the same. Me, Aiden, and the advisor were actually the last ones in the cabin, as everyone was hanging out in the cabin. Anyways, once it hit around 9, our group leader made some announcements before we went to bed, including mentioning what Aiden said earlier about showers. He also talked about not sneaking out and other stuff that I wouldn't have done regardless if it wasn't allowed. Then he turned off the lights and we all went to sleep. Well, some of us. Sleeping here was incredibly difficult for me, especially on the first night. Sleeping in front of 21 strangers felt super weird to me, as they all had their own sleeping patterns. In fact, a rising 4th grader who slept in the bunk next to mine literally got naked in front of everyone in the cabin and then hopped in the bed. Now, listen, if you sleep naked, I don't care, but if you do that shit in front of an entire cabin, you're weird. But yet this kid thought nothing of it and just went to sleep, which still amazes me to this day how you can do this without thinking that it's at least somewhat weird. There is also the issue of people snoring. I don't fall asleep easily in places with loud noises, including snoring, so that also makes falling asleep harder. Additionally, I only brought with me a single thin blanket that did not cover my entire body. This is also made worse by the fact that the cabin was freezing cold at night, so I was also getting cold too. Then you had the internal factors too. I severely missed home. The camp rules and curfews were much stricter than what I had at home. I couldn't have a single bit of privacy or alone time because I was constantly around others, and I was also already becoming completely socially drained. It also didn't help that I couldn't even distract myself with a video game or music or even contact my parents, since all that stuff was prohibited. It got so bad that I even considered overeating and getting sick just so I could go home early. I decided not to do that, but it was a serious thought that came to mind that night while I was lying there. Ultimately, I do not know how long or what time I fell asleep. I estimated that it took me 3 hours in Storytime 48, but really it could have been a lot longer or a little bit less time, as I completely lost track of the time that night. In fact, I had no knowledge of time whatsoever throughout my time here, so I couldn't give an accurate schedule of things just because I had never had any idea of time I was at camp. However, I guess it was around 6 o'clock when I woke up to a tap. I opened my eyes and saw Aiden standing there. However, he was standing on the railing because the floor got eerily wet. By eerily wet, I mean that he said, "Zach, I think the weird kid pissed himself." I slowly got up there and sure enough, there were literal piss on the ground. I also noticed that the weird kid's blanket were wet as well, and considering the advisor already told me that he was a bedwetter, I had no doubt in my mind that the weird kid pissed himself. So choosing to sleep on the top bunk was certainly a lifesaver. However, there was still the issue of my clothes, as my clothes were in the suitcase, which was underneath the weird kid's bed. But by some miracle, my clothes were still clean and had no piss on them. I did move my suitcase beside the bunk so I knew for sure it wouldn't get wet if he pissed the bed again, which he thankfully did not. Now, moving on from one weird incident to another, let's talk about showering, because the first shower was one of the most uncomfortable as well as even a very disturbing experience. So how showers worked here was that we took them at the bathhouse, which was about 50 yards away from the cabin. When you walked inside, to the right would be where all the stalls were and the sinks, so basically just a normal bathroom. But to the left you have the showers. Now, unlike the stalls where there were like 30 of them, there are only 6 showers. However, only 5 showers were used, as the 6th one at the very end of the shower area had no curtain. And of course being mine as well as I think 5 other cabins, that meant over 100 of us, not including the camp counselors, had to share these 5 showers. So as you can expect, these got crowded, especially at night. That's why Aiden advised me to take my daily shower in the morning, since at night there would be usually a whole line of people waiting to take a shower. Meanwhile, in the morning there were not nearly as many people around, so I was able to get a shower pretty easily. Now, if you've seen any movies or read any books about camp, then you probably know that hot water is basically non-existent at camp. However, this camp worked a little differently, as while they did have hot water, the hot water was blistering hot. Like, I kid you not, if you take a let's say 5-minute shower on even the slightest mode of hot water, you can get yourself a 2nd degree burn. Therefore, I was stuck taking cold showers throughout my time here, which were absolutely agonizing to do. But at least that made taking a shower when I got home a priority, which I'll touch on later. Anyways, once I got done, I quickly realized that I had a big problem. Both my towel and clothes were on the bench in front of the shower. Meanwhile, I was wearing nothing but a pair of sandals, since these showers were pretty dirty. And just to make it worse, some kids decided to wait in the shower area, as by the time I was finished with my shower, a line had formed. Therefore, if I walked outside the shower, I would be seen by a bunch of people, which I did not want whatsoever. Fortunately, a man who I assume was either a group leader or a camp director was passing by to take his shower. I knew that if I could get his attention, I'd get him to throw my towel over and then I would have something to cover myself with as I put on my clothes. So that's what I did. I whispered to this man to get his attention and asked him to throw my towel over. However, let's just say that this creepy ass motherfucker was nothing short of a pervert. Instead of throwing over my towel like I asked, this man opened my shower curtain while I was standing there naked and handed it to me while I was just trying to cover myself. Now, listen, I get he was helping me out, but come on, you absolutely cannot convince me that this was just a miscommunication. Like, I'm not the best when it comes to common sense, but even I know that when someone asks you to throw their towel over, they literally mean that they want you to throw their fucking towel over because they aren't wearing any clothes. So judging by that alone, I think that this damn pedophile had perverted intentions for helping me. And just to make things even more suspicious, he looked maybe 45 or 50 years old while I was of course 11. So if that doesn't scream pedophile, I don't know what does. And so after that shenanigans, I drawed off and then put my clothes on. Afterwards, I went back to the cabin and laid down for a couple minutes before the camp bell rang and we as a group went to the center of the camp. So every morning, the camp did a morning prayer where all camp members, counselors, group leaders, and directors would get in a large circle while the camp owner was in the middle and made announcements. Once she finished announcing everything she wanted to announce, she then would pray with us and then it was time to eat breakfast. And just like any other meal, I do not remember anything for breakfast, so let's talk about electives. So electives were like choice activities we chose to sign up for, which we signed up for 2. Well, Mom signed me up for me, and surprisingly, she actually made good selections on what to sign me up for. The first elective I had was arts and crafts. This is pretty much the same thing as crafts from VBS, where we of course were given some materials and a piece of art or craft. This was probably my favorite part of the day during camp, as art took place inside in the air-conditioned room, and other than at night, I was sweating all day, even in the morning, so this is a nice refresher. Another thing to note was that this was one of the only times I was around girls here. While they split the boys and girls for everything, they didn't for the electives, as I was an elective with maybe 5 girls and 2 boys. I didn't talk to the girls since they were all friends and only talked to each other, nor did I talk with the other boys since the 2 of them were friends with each other, so I mostly just stayed quiet and worked on my own thing during this time. Afterwards, we had our second elective. My second one was archery, so archery was a little bit of a walk. Additionally, there were also a lot more people in this elective, including Aiden and the advisor, so I at least knew a couple people. Anyways, this was overall a really fun elective. For this day, the elective leader just showed us how to use a bow and provided safety tips, but starting the next day, we would do some shooting and target practice, so overall, archery was pretty cool. Then came lunch and afterwards came free time. During our free time, me and most others in my cabin laid in our beds since it was hot outside and was a little cooler in the cabin. However, it seems like that the boys in the other cabins chose not to spend their free time relaxing and instead decided to spend their time pranking other cabins. More specifically, they spent their free time ding-dong ditching other cabins since all of our group leaders were in a meeting. And of course they did that to us, even if none of us were partaking in the ding-dong ditching ourselves. Now, for the first time this happened, nobody in our cabin had any reaction. Nobody except the weird kid. He volunteered to open the door to see who it was, and when he opened the door, nobody was there. "I think someone just ding-dong ditched us," he said to the cabin as he shut the door. None of us really cared, but he was so blissfully offended that we got ding-dong ditched that he sat there by the door waiting for them to do it again. And a couple boys told him to go back to his bunk, but he did not oblige and waited for the pranksters. But sure enough, the pranksters did come back. No reaction from the rest of us, but a loud roar came from the weird kid. He immediately opened a door where the boys who ding-dong ditched us had already ran off. The weird kid then shouted, "Stop ding-dong ditching!" at the pranksters while we begged him to just go back to his bed. But again, he did not oblige, but rather than waiting for the pranksters some more, the weird kid decided that he was going to get into the action and went to the cabin these boys came from and attempted to ding-dong ditch them. This did not go as well for the weird kid expected, as the cabin was prepared for him to do this, as they had half their members wait behind the cabin to surround him while the other half stayed inside, completely trapping the weird kid. I know this because we sent a representative from our cabin to see how things were doing, and since we heard screams from the weird kid. When the cabin noticed the representative cheered them on and told them that they could keep him, and we back to our cabin and told us what happened, where we all began laughing and cheering. The weird kid eventually returned once it was pool time, but he refused to tell us what they did to him. but whatever he got, he kind of deserved it since we as a cabin specifically told him 3 times to ignore the pranksters. And that brings me to pool time. So that was of course our time we got to spend in the pool. They also offered a swim test for anyone who missed it the day before, which I of course did and passed pretty easily, so I could swim in the deep end. But alongside being deeper wet waters, the deep end also had a diving board, which is where most of us went to. We all lined up and took turns jumping off the board. However, there was a man who had been in the pool since before we arrived. He was sitting on a float in the middle of the deep end, but rather than laying there and relaxing, he was all about us jumping off the board. He especially was crazy about us doing belly flops. Now, for those who have never done a belly flop, they hurt like crazy because, as the name implies, you literally fall in the water flat on your stomach. I did a few of these when I learned how to dive, and believe me, those hurt. So him encouraging us to do this was kind of uncool, since he wanted us to go out of our way to get hurt just for his pleasure. And just to make things worse, he also would often complain when we did not do a belly flop, often making insults and other stuff that makes me question why he was even allowed to work here. In fact, this was the only time I ever saw him, as no camp counselors or leaders were around, since they all went and did something else, and our supervisor for pool were the lifeguards. This man was not a lifeguard nor a leader, so I don't know what this man was doing or if he even worked for the camp. However, it then became my turn, and this is what made this man even more weird. So he of course tried to get me to do a belly flop like with everyone else, but I chose not to oblige and did a dive. And then when I reached the surface, I heard him shout, "Y'all are worse than the girls." Now, I might be overthinking this, but I still feel that I have a reasonable doubt to call this man a weirdo for just like that man from the shower. While his comment sounded innocent to 11-year-old me at the time, it poses a shit ton of red flags to now 19-year-old me. Reason being is that from this comment, he's saying that he was in the pool with the girls. And just to prove my point, he was already in the pool in his float when we arrived. So he was in the pool with the girls, which is absolutely 100% creepy, as no way should a grown-ass 50-year-old Reddit mod looking ass wearing nothing but a pair of swimming trunks be in the pool at the same time as a bunch of 9 to 12-year-old girls. Hell, he shouldn't even been in the pool with us boys either, since that's also creepy as hell. And what makes this even all the more creepier is that this was the only time he was in the pool. On Tuesday and Wednesday, he wouldn't be in the pool. I of course can't be certain, but I think someone probably complained. Additionally, our group leaders would begin watching us from the beach. Or, not from the beach, from the bench. So I think something happened to this man. I don't know for sure since they never told us what happened to him, but good god, who the hell is letting Reddit mods work at this camp? Like, he as well as that man from the shower actually look like what you would imagine a Reddit or a Discord mod to look like. I'm not kidding. Anyways, after that, we moved on. However, as much as I write about camp, I actually have zero recollection of what happened between after pool time and before dinner on Monday. Like, I remember what we did on Tuesday and Wednesday during this block, but I don't remember at all what happened during this time, but I would assume it had to do with a competition between ours and the other boys' cabin, since that's what we did on Tuesday and Wednesday. Anyways, after we ate dinner, we then had our second big ass session, which wasn't really anything too special. After that, we had our nightly free time. I spent my time playing carpet ball. So the little breezeway where carpet ball was played had a bunch of carpet ball sets where you can line up and take turns playing against someone. The winner kept playing while the loser went back to the line. However, when it was my turn, I literally never had to go back in line because I won every single match. I think I played roughly 15 matches and I won all of them. In fact, the line from my side completely disappeared since everyone knew I was going to win. So yeah, I was getting pretty good at carpet ball. Then once I saw people go to their cabins, I went to mine and lights out was almost immediately when I returned. Now, sleeping Monday night was so much easier than sleeping Sunday night, as now I wasn't nearly as homesick and felt a little better. I still absolutely dreaded camp and wanted to go home, but it was at least a little more bearable, so it did not take as long to fall asleep, although I still think it took me around an hour to fall asleep. And that brings me to Tuesday. So while Tuesday and Wednesday still sucked since I was at camp, they were still way better than Sunday and Monday. For one, let's talk about showers. So on Tuesday morning after Aiden woke me up, I developed a strategy for taking showers. What I did was that I took my shower at the second to last shower stall, the one beside the one without a curtain. I would then hang my towel on the wall that split mine and the curtainless shower, allowing me to immediately dry myself after my shower and then cover myself when I get my clothes. This strategy worked super well and did not have to worry about some pervert trying to look at me. So yeah, showers were a lot easier to take now. After that, I had a little bit of more time to relax, so I did that until the bell rang and then went to the center of the camp for morning prayer and then ate breakfast. After breakfast, we did our electives. None of them were really anything particularly special that day, so let's jump over to free time. So instead of just hanging out in the cabin, I decided to play some carpet ball, and just like the night before, I beat the shit out of everyone. However, That's when a group of rising 7th graders from a different cabin came over and were super cocky. They were all like, nah, you ain't that good, these people are all weak, type stuff, and then challenged me. I of course accepted their challenge, and I played against the 3 of them while everyone nearby came over and watched, since they knew that these 3 games were going to get good. Now, while I normally am not a fan of being the center of attention, this was one of the few times where I loved it, as I absolutely embarrassed these rising 7th graders. Like, there were 3 of them as this group, and not only not only did 2 of them I can't read. Okay, so basically, not only were 2 of them could not knock my balls off, not even a dummy. And then there were but then there was also one who had to like leave early because I embarrassed them so much. And of course, after I beat them, the crowd that had formed around us watched and cheered on. But when I beat the 3rd one, not 5th one, they all went wild. Like, there were sodas being thrown, so much cheering and applause, and all around it was just crazy. But amongst this crowd was actually some camp counselors. One of them came over and congratulated me and invited me to sign up for the carpet ball tournament that was happening the next day. I took him up on his offer and entered the tournament, which I'll touch on when we get to Wednesday. After that, it was pool time. The man from before was of course not here, so swimming wasn't as awkward. I also noticed the rising 7th graders I'd beat in carpet ball sit out, which was really funny since they were like the coolest guys ever just an hour ago, and now they're a bunch of wimps. God, I love karma. Anyways, after pool time, we all headed over to the conference building where big ass sessions were held. Here we did our cabin competitions I talked about earlier. I don't remember what we did on Monday, but I do remember what we did on Tuesday and Wednesday, so let's talk about what we did on Tuesday. So the competition here was a dance competition, which, listen, that might have worked for the girls, but not for the boys. Me nor anyone in our cabin could or wanted to dance, so that made this competition rather hard to do, but the counselors and our group leaders were insistent, so that's what happened. So the counselors taught each of us this dance to a trap remix of the Little Einsteins. But thankfully, we were not required to participate. So as expected, me and everyone else in our group just chose to sit out. However, when our group was called and nobody came up, our group leader was absolutely furious. He basically scolded us and said that we were all embarrassing ourselves by not participating, which was stupid because going up on stage and dancing would be way more embarrassing than sitting out. However, he then said that if none of us went up there, he was going to force us all to go up there and dance. The counselors tried to intervene and tell him that none of us had to participate, but he was not having any of it. But thankfully, a couple rising 4th graders gave in and said they'll go up and dance. All of us breathed a huge sigh of relief and we cheered them on, not to encourage them, but to thank them. And as expected, they were not very impressive on stage. They just stood there while doing a couple motions. This made our group leader even more angry, while the rest of us were just happy to have some boys stand up for us. In fact, when they announced that we got last place, none of us cared except the group leader. We were just glad for this to be over with. After that, we ate dinner and then our big guy session, which I have no memory of. However, I do remember what happened after the big guy session. So our group leader was still really pissed about the performance during the dance competition, so he demanded that instead of having our free time before bed, after our big session, we immediately had to go to the cabin and go to bed, which at this point, he was just taking his frustration way too far. Like, come on, we're boys, we don't dance, so we all went back to the cabin together. Although we did not have to go to sleep immediately, we were still forced to stay inside, so some boys began talking. That's when the weird kid comes up again, so while everyone was talking, he decided that he was going to be a weird. By the way, I was not talking to anyone, I was just laying in bed. But anyways, the weird kid decided that he was going to chime in into the cabin's conversation and talk about penises. He basically began talking about how he saw this massive wee-wee in the bathroom and then started talking about his own. He then asked us if we wanted to see his, to which nobody said anything since we were all grossed out. However, our group leader spoke up, not because he wanted to see this kid's wee-wee, but to scold him. Already pissed off from the dance competition, our group leader just went off on this kid, telling him about how inappropriate he was being and how he needed to repent to God, and basically stuff that they say at Christian camps. After that, our group leader immediately turned the lights off and forced us all to go to bed. While we were all still mad at our group leader for his pettiness over the dance competition, the situation was what led us to forgiving him, as the weird kid was just grossing us all out. Like, none of us wanted to see or hear about his penis. Although, to be fair, even if he did go about showing it off, we'd probably need a microscope to see it. But nonetheless, none of us wanted to see it, so we were all thankful for our group leader for shutting this kid off. And that brings us to Wednesday, which was our last full day at camp. Thankfully, thank God, because I wanted to go home. Anyways, the shower, morning prayer, breakfast, and electives went pretty normally, so let's talk about the carpet ball tournament since that took place during free time. So how this tournament worked was that there was a winner's bracket and a loser's bracket. Everyone starts in the winner's bracket, but if you lose, you enter the loser's bracket. So the final round would be between the undefeated player and a player who lost only once. However, we won't need to worry about the loser's bracket, since I never entered it, as I was the undefeated player up for the championship. And then for the championship, this is a game between me and the winner of the previous year. So it was a case of the current champion versus the underdog, and in this case, the underdog won. I had already beat this kid 2 rounds beforehand, which is how we ended up in the loser's bracket. So this round was basically just me replicating what I did earlier. However, there was one more match I would have to partake in, and that was against the camp owner. So the camp owner, alongside being the owner, was a carpet ball goddess. She always challenges the winner of the tournament every year, which she always won against since she became the camp owner 15 years before this. So now I have to compete against my greatest opponent yet. This would ultimately be the game that I put the camp owner's long winning streak to an end, as I completely obliterated her. I ended up beating her in just 2 rounds, which is crazy hard to do because that means you have to knock 2 balls in 2 turns, but I did that while she only knocked my dummy ball. But yeah, the 15-year champion has officially been beaten by a random socially drained 11-year-old boy who was so desperate to go home. The owner awarded me with $15, which I of course spent on candy and sodas like any other 11-year-old would, and yeah, I was the new carpet ball champion. Ultimately, I retired from carpet ball after this game, and even 8 years later, I have still yet to touch this game again, and I've basically moved on. So it was nice to have that match against the owner as my last carpet ball match. After that, it was time to cool down in the pool, so that's what me and the other boys did. But what makes this part memorable is actually what happens afterwards. So after pool time, I always went to the bathhouse to change into my dry clothes, so I did that. However, as I walked outside the cabin, I heard a familiar voice shout "fuck" as loud as it could. That familiar voice came from the weird kid. Now, listen, saying the F word or another bad word is nothing special. I use that word all the time, and I've already used it a few times in the story time. But what made this special was that this happened at a Christian camp, where saying a bad word is treated worse than murder. However, I was not the only one who heard this bad word, as our group leader and the other boys from the cabin heard from the cabin. So our group leader came over stompingly angry. He first apprehended me and asked me if I heard the weird kid say that word, which I told him that I did and even told him where the weird kid was in the shower area. Normally, I don't snitch because snitches get stitches, but considering that this is the weird kid, I made an exception since the weird kid was really grossing all of us out as well as just to get back at him for pissing on my suitcase. Well, almost pissing on my suitcase. And plus, the rest of the cabin wanted to hear this kid get laid into, so I figured I'd let him hear it. And sure enough, our group leader laid into this kid, saying that this kind of language was inappropriate and that he needed to watch his mouth and of course the usual Christian stuff like you need to repent and ask God for forgiveness and all that stuff. Ultimately, this kid's punishment was that he could not participate in our cabin competitions, which were much more intriguing than dancing, so he had to miss out on that. Additionally, he had to call his parents letting them know what he said and that stuff too. So yeah, he got himself into some trouble. So moving on to our last cabin competition. So this one was done outside behind our cabin. For it, we did relay races. I don't really remember these very well, but I do remember one race where we took turns soaking a sponge with water and trying to fill a bucket, which was actually pretty nice since it was 94 degrees outside, so that allowed us to cool off for a bit. But other than that, I don't remember much. After that, we had dinner and then the big ass session. So this big ass session worked differently, as this was parents' night, so a lot of parents came and saw their kid. My parents didn't come, which didn't really hurt my feelings, as I knew I'd see them the next day. And after the big ass session, I immediately went back to the cabin and went straight to bed. The best part was that I fell asleep quickly, as I was excited for the next day when I finally would leave camp. Anyways, let's talk about the last day of camp. So Aiden woke me up that morning, but told me that his dad didn't care if we took a shower that day. So I decided to wait till I get home so I could take one of the best showers I've ever had. We then did our morning prayer, breakfast, and electives, and then after that, we did our final big ass session. A lot of kids were very bummed out about camp being over, but for me, I was really excited since I hated it here and was ready to go home. Anyways, once that was over, we got our stuff packed and packed up the van, and then we headed on back home. On the way back home, I actually did not sit by myself, as the advisor sat with me. Additionally, we were behind Aiden's seat, so we three talked the whole way back home. Then we made it back. Mom was waiting for me, so I got my stuff out of the van, loaded onto Mom's, and headed home. Now, the first question Mom always asks when I finish a church trip is, how was it? Usually I say that it was good, even if I had an awful experience. However, for this, I did not even hesitate to say how bad it was, which Mom wasn't really too happy to hear. I didn't mention the story about that guy from the shower, the weird kid, but I just mentioned the more general stuff like getting no privacy and never having any alone time and stuff like that. This had Mom dumbfounded, since she of course was a camp lover and did camp all the time when she was a kid, so she expected I would have the same thoughts about camp as her, so she then basically laughed at me and said I had a good experience. I have no idea why the hell she was thinking, as if I said I had a bad experience, that means I literally had a bad experience. Like, her saying I had a good one would not change my mind. But to be fair, while I did have an awful experience at camp, it wasn't entirely bad, as there were some good moments like Aiden being a dumbass on the ride up there and winning the carpet ball tournament, but I absolutely never wanted to go back to camp, and even now at 19 years old, I still do not want to go back to camp. And then we arrived back home, which felt incredibly nice. I got my stuff unpacked and then took a shower, which was probably the best shower I've ever taken. It felt really nice getting warm water and was just a very relaxing shower. And then after that, I barely went out of my room and did not interact with anyone until that Sunday, since I was of course recharging my social battery, so I didn't do anything but play video games for the next few days. And yeah, that was my experience at camp. It sucked, but I got through and thankfully never have to go through that experience again. Now let's backtrack to why Mom had me go here. The reason was that she wanted me to meet other boys I'd be going to school with who also went to church. Did I do that? Yeah. But did I create friendships at school? No. You see, the only boy from camp that I shared classes with was the advisor. However, we both did not interact much throughout the school year, as he's popular and has his own stuff going on. So really, this was a failure, and there would not be any difference have been any difference in the process of making friends had I not gone to camp. Anyways, nothing else really happened for the rest of that summer other than in August when we went to Daytona Beach, Florida for our annual family vacation. It was a cool trip, but nothing too special happened. And that finally brings us to 6th grade. Yeah, the summer of 2015 was that eventful just because of camp alone. Ultimately, while I was terrified as hell to start the school year, I was at least glad to be over with the summer, since the summer of 2015 was probably the second worst summer ever, with the absolute worst one being summer 2020, which I'll touch on in part 7. So let's talk about my first day of 6th grade, as well as my first day of school not at my elementary school. So my alarm went off at 6:30 on Monday, August 24th. Immediately, I got really scared, since of course this was the first day of intermediate school. Everyone already knew each other in the school structure, while I was the only one who didn't, so this was an even more terrifying transition, and then simply the first day of middle school where everyone is scared. But so I got ready and got my stuff packed, but then Dad drove me over to school. While we arrived, he said a few words of encouragement, and then I walked inside. So the way the school was structured was that when you entered from the car rider line, you entered into the gym. From the gym, you could follow a long vertical hallway that goes to the center of the school, and it's right at the front office. When you walk down this hallway, you'll pass the cafeteria, library, and 4 horizontal halls. The first hall on the left is Hall 4, and the second hall on the left is Hall 2. Meanwhile, the first hall on the right is Hall 3, and the second hall on the right is Hall 1. Each hall had 2 teams, with the 5th grade teams being on Halls 1 and 3, and the 6th grade teams being on Halls 2 and 4. Teams were basically collections of students with 3 teachers each, although my team only had 2 teachers. But this is how they all separated all of us since there were over 600 of us. Yeah, this is a pretty big school. I'll explain the 6th grade teams more in depth in a second. Anyways, when I entered the gym, there was this woman who was in charge of watching over everyone and making sure they were not acting up. She was also in charge of telling us where to sit, as each hall had a designated place to sit in the bleachers. She then apprehended me and told me where Hall 2 sat, since that's where that's what hall my team had classes in. So I went and sat there. You'll come to find that this woman was a kind of a bitch, as she had a problem with basically anyone doing anything, and I'll get to something really petty that she did to me when we get to October. I'll refer to her as the drop-off teacher for the story time. But for now, let's talk about going to homeroom. So I have no idea why, but this school was way stricter than my elementary school. Like back in elementary school, when we were dropped off, we immediately went to class on our own. Like as a kindergartner, I literally remember just walking to class when I was dropped off. But here, they required that we wait in the gym first, and then we had to walk in a single file line to our class. Yeah, they treated us like babies here. And this wasn't the only immature system the school had. Like I genuinely had far less freedom here than I had at elementary school. That's embarrassing. Anyways, let's talk about teams. So as mentioned, each grade had 4 teams, and each hall had 2 teams. The team I was on was the Sharks. This is a small team, as there are only 2 teachers. Each team is supposed to have 3 teachers, 1 for math, 1 for English, and 1 for science. But due to a shortage, I think, our team only had 2. Both of our teachers were qualified to teach science and socials, or teach science, since it was the science teacher that was missing. So therefore, each teacher taught their homeroom science that morning, and in the afternoon, they would teach their respective subject. So it worked out. Anyways, I had the math teacher as my homeroom, so I would have her for both science and math, and then have English teacher for English. Pretty solid workaround if I say so myself. So my first class was of course science. I'll refer to my science teacher as my math teacher since that's the main subject she taught. Anyways, my math teacher was okay. I don't really remember her very much, but I do remember her that while she was nice, she wasn't really the best teacher. She often got mad at the class for doing poorly on exams, which I assess was poor teacher behavior from part 1. It's not really the best teacher. But anyways, I of course had her for science and math, so this was my first class of the day with her. After science, we had WIN, which stands for What I Need. It's basically a class that allows students to work on their weaknesses and strengths. If you've seen part 1, then you know that this is when I had my interpersonal class, a class for neurodivergent students to help them navigate socializing and getting along with others. This was a disability accommodation provided me since I'm autistic, and I would have these again in 6th grade for WIN on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I would have WIN with my English teacher. However, WIN did not start until September, so for now, we just had an extended science class. But then after our WIN time was up, we moved on to Encores. So if you've seen part 1, then you could simply think of these as specials from elementary school, just that the schedules worked a little differently. And for those who have not seen part 1, Encores were basically the extracurricular subjects we took like PE, music, art, that stuff. They weren't for a grade, although there were 2 Encore teachers who tried to get their class to be part of our grade, but I'll talk more about how both their efforts failed when we get there. Anyways, Encores worked on a 3-day rotation schedule, so for the first day of school, we had PE, on the second day we had iSkills, and on the third, we had art. Then on the fourth, we repeated the cycle, but in every quarter, we would swap between iSkills and library. So for the second quarter, we had library, and art only lasted for the first semester, as we would have music for the second one. PE would go for the entire school year. I know this is all really complicated. In fact, this format had me confused quite a bit, it has me a little bit confused even 8 years later, but I'll tell y'all when we switch classes to make things easier. But for now, just know that Encores I had for the first quarter of the school year were PE, iSkills, and art. Alright, so let's talk about PE. So this is when PE started to suck. In elementary school, PE was the best thing ever. I had a really sweet PE teacher who actively engaged everyone and was super nice, and PE was the best part of the week, not including recess because recess was always the best part of the week. However, at intermediate school, the PE teacher was not as nice. She was more like a typical PE teacher, as she was rude, snarky, and yelled a lot. She was at least a lot nicer to the more well-behaved students, so she was much nicer to me, but to others, she had a typical PE teacher mindset. Still at least way better than the PE teachers I had in middle school, whom I'll talk about in parts 3 and 4. Anyways, we also shared this PE class with another homeroom. They were also a 6th grade class, but they were on a different team, so oftentimes we did team versus team games. Well, that is when we were able to get to them. We rarely got to these because our teacher had us do a whole 8 stretches and 7 exercises as our warm-up. Each of these lasted roughly 3 minutes, as they also expected us to do them properly. Otherwise, we would have to start over. So if you do the math, that's 45 minutes of warming up. Considering PE lasted I think 50 minutes, yeah, we never did much in PE outside of warming up. So PE sucked. I'll discuss iSkills and art when I get to the second and third days of school. Anyways, after Encores came lunch. So lunch was another reason why I say that the school was much stricter than my elementary school. So how seating worked was that our team had 2 long tables reserved, but we cannot just sit wherever we want at these tables. Instead, we had to basically fill the seats. So the next empty seat that was available, we had to sit there. Back at elementary school, we were allowed to sit wherever we wanted to at like specific reserved tables. So now your seating group depended on what place you were in line you were. Honestly though, I'm actually quite glad they had this system in place, since if they didn't, I likely would have been sitting by myself for the first first couple of weeks. I did eventually find my group, and I'll touch on that later, but for now, this actually benefited me quite a bit. Honestly, I think that they should have had this only had this system in place for the first quarter, and use it again only as a punishment after that. However, my seating arrangement was usually very linear, as I was one of those kids who brought their lunch to school, as I don't know how people eat school food. Like, that stuff's not even food, it's microwave cow shit with hot piss sprayed on it. So of course I usually brought my lunch. Therefore, I was usually one of the first to sit down. Anyways, after lunch, it was time for second block. Second block for me was English, so me and roughly half the class made our way to English. Now, I had one of the coolest teachers ever for English. Not only was he a fantastic teacher, but he was one of the most interesting teachers I had. Outside of being an English teacher, he also worked for the Carolina Panthers and the Charlotte Hornets. This was especially cool by the fact that this was probably the best time to be a Panthers fan, since this was the season that they went 15-1. In fact, I even kind of got into football during this time, although I would lose my interest after the Super Bowl and have not been interested in that since. But nonetheless, having a teacher who also worked for the Panthers during this time was really cool. As for him as a teacher, he was also really cool. So probably the main thing I remember from his class were stems. So stems were basically like root words. In other words, they're basically prefixes and suffixes. So things like pre, which means before, and by, which means to. That stuff. We learned 5 new stems every week, and we actually did activities with stems every day. So on Mondays, we created foldables within our notebook, where we put the stem and its meaning on the front. Then on Tuesdays, we wrote 3 examples of the words with the stem. So if we had the stem by, we might write words such as bicycle, biplane, and binoculars. Then on Wednesdays, we wrote a sentence with a word that has our stem. So we might have written a sentence like, a biplane has 2 sets of wings, or something like that. On Thursdays, we drew an illustration of the stem's meaning. So we might draw 2 people or 2 lines for by. And then on Fridays, we took a test. These tests were extremely easy. Like, to not make 100 on these, you had to purposely miss a question. And considering that these were also counted as test grades, yeah, keeping an A in this class was really easy to do. And just to make stems even more enjoyable, as well as how I still remember them today, we had made hand motions for each stem every Monday. So for by, we held up 2 fingers since it of course means 2. We did these throughout the year, although we would not do them during non-full weeks. So like Thanksgiving week, when we only went to school Monday and Tuesday, we did not do stems. Another thing I want to touch on regarding English is a thing we did called Accelerated Reader, or AR as I'll refer to it as. We did this throughout elementary school, but it never was all that significant, which is why I didn't touch on it in part 1. But AR had a very significant role in 6th grade, and that's why I'll touch on it here. It would then become insignificant in 7th grade, but it would become a little more prevalent in 8th grade, so I'll also touch on it in part 4. Anyhow, AR is basically this program that my county did where students would have to find a book from the library, read it, and then go to the AR website and take a quiz on the book, which we often called AR test. AR test would simply be on the plot of the book, so none of that literary nonsense like what we did in English. Each quiz had 5 or 10 questions depending on how long the book was, although Harry Potter books had 20 questions since those were just a ton to unpack from those books. Now, each book was worth a certain amount of points, so if we got a 100 on an AR test, we could get all 100% of the points. If we got an 80, we get 80% of the points, and if we got less than a 70, we got no points. Each quarter, we had to have a certain number of points that we had to attain, which we called our AR goal. We also had a different AR goal each quarter, and I'll touch on what my goal was for each quarter. However, we also had to maintain an 85% average on our exams, so we couldn't keep doing shit and grind points. We actually had to read the book entirely and pray to God that we get a good score. So that's how AR worked. Now what made AR really significant for 6th grade compared to other school years was that my teacher used it properly. In previous school years, I absolutely dreaded AR because our teachers would often use it as punishment. Like with my 3rd grade teacher, who was a bitch for those who haven't seen part 1, would literally put us in silent lunch if we did not have our AR goals met by the 4th week of the quarter. And other teachers did this as well, making AR absolutely dreadful and is actually the reason I hate reading even now as an adult. My music just turned off. Like, I recently tried to read the manga for Re:Zero, which is my all-time favorite anime, and I just couldn't enjoy it. Even when Subaru got to Roswell's castle and when Rin began catching feelings for him, which is when the show gets really good. Much of that is because I focus on every single detail. AR taught me how to examine every itty-bitty thing in a book rather than actually enjoy the plot and make inferences. It's not like I could simply stop doing this, as AR drilled this into me so much that even though I haven't taken an AR test in over 5 years, I still read like I'm preparing for one since it's been ingrained into me. However, what my English teacher did that made AR fun is that he did not punish us for AR. Instead, he created a reward system, so he would often give us rewards like food and other goodies for each milestone we got towards our AR goal, and if we met our AR goal, the school had a school-wide reward for us. However, our teacher also provided rewards for doubling and tripling our AR goal. This encouraged us to continue reading even after reaching our goal. As a result, he made AR really fun and very memorable for the school year. My 7th and 8th grade English teachers would unfortunately not use this system and instead use it as punishment like what my elementary school did, so that's why AR was not significant these years outside of putting a toll on my mental health in 8th grade, which I'll of course touch on in part 4. So yeah, that's how AR worked. My goal for the first quarter was 17 points, and I'll touch on how I met that goal and what the reward was when I get to October. So now let's move on and talk about the third block, which was math. So 6th grade math is very broad and is one of the most important math classes students take prior to Algebra 1. This class has a ton of material that ranges from all sorts of math disciplines, from things like ratios, proportions, and percentages to conceptual algebra to geometry, to even some statistics, which is my strongest discipline. This class was very broad, so we had a lot of material to go over. As a result, with the exception of Algebra 1 in 8th grade, this was probably the class I think I learned the most from back in school. But unlike Algebra 1 where the material was crammed and we had a ton of homework, this class was actually pretty easy because our teacher organized the material really well. And after math came recess. So for recess, our teachers took the team outside alongside with some balls and other outside stuff. So we could play football, soccer, throw frisbee, or whatever we wanted. I ended up playing football on this particular day, although in the future, me and the boys I played football with would play jackpot along our English teacher occasionally. These were usually fun times. Not nearly as fun as the soccer games from elementary school, but there were a few moments when jackpot got good. And after recess, we went inside and had about 15 minutes of study hall. Although sometimes we would use this time for team meetings, and as I'll get to later, a team-wide reading session was actually pretty fun. Anyways, for the first day of school, this time was used as a team meeting, where teachers basically just talked about how things were going, what their expectations were for the school year, and just basically that first day of school stuff. And then after that, we were dismissed. So yeah, that's how the first day of school worked for me. Let's move on to the second day, which it of course worked a little differently than the first day. Firstly, let's talk about a morning assembly that my school did starting this day and would do so for the next week. So this school followed an acronym called PRIDE. No, I'm not talking about sexuality or being gay and that stuff. If I was, then I would be raising a lot of questions about why the teachers were even allowed near a school zone. But when I say pride, I'm talking about perseverance, respect, integrity driven, and I forgot the E. These are like the school's values, if that's what you want to call them. So being the first week of school, they really wanted to drive these into us. This also brings me to a form of punishment they used if a student did not show these values, and that was Pride Academy. So Pride Academy was pretty much just detention where you sat at a desk and did schoolwork all day. It's similar to in-school suspension, ISS, but it's not an entire day, just part of the day. I'll bring this up since I'll reference it a couple times throughout the story time. Anyways, another acronym that was brought up was actually a county-wide system is PBIS. I'm not sure what this acronym stood for, but PBIS was a system where we would carry these planners, called trackers, around and after each class, we would get a stamp. But if we were an asshole during class, we would not get a stamp. We had to have a certain number of stamps each quarter in order to participate in what they called the PBIS reward, as well as not having 2 or more office referrals for that quarter. In other words, PBIS was pretty much a disciplinary system that focused more on rewarding good behavior over punishing bad behavior. Now, the school combined PBIS and Pride into a song with the beat of Boom Boom Pow, an old Black Eyed Peas song that if you're old enough, you might remember. This song is ass, by the way, so don't bother listening to it if you're too young to remember it. But anyways, for the chorus of the song, we basically spelled out each letter in Pride and what they represent. And for the verse, it was about PBIS. I still actually remember some of the lyrics to the verse, which the first 2 being I like that PBIS because I can get my stamps, and when I get my stamps I can go have fun. As well as the last lyric being, and when I walk out of those rooms, those stamps go boom boom boom. I don't remember what's in between, but this song, as expected, was worse than the original, which I still have no idea how the school fucked up so badly that they made a Black Eyed Peas song worse than it actually was, but they managed to do that. However, after teaching us the song, the drop-off teacher required that we sing the song. So she played the song, and who would have guessed it? Not many people sung it. This is exactly what you should expect from an assembly of over 600 preteens. Ain't none of us gonna sing that. But for some reason, this completely flabbergasted the drop-off teacher. Like, she could not believe that we were not interested in singing this song. So she did announce that if we did not start singing, she was going to have some of us come up front and sing it in front of everyone. This got some people to sing, but not many. So the drop-off people stuck to her threat and actually called some people up to the front to sing. I got super lucky, as she actually called the person next to me. I was never called, so I could continue standing there and lip-sync. I think that if she forced me to, I likely would have had an even tougher time making friends this school year. But after that, we started our first block late, although not too late since we still had not started WIN just yet. So our first block was actually the same length as it normally was. Then came encores. So our encores on this day was iSkills, which took place in Hall 1. iSkills is basically a class about computers. For the first quarter, we worked on typing as well as how to log into a school computer. Then in the third quarter, we talked about research and creating the website, which I'll touch more on in February. But since I already knew how to log into a school computer and type, this is a super forgettable encore, so I won't touch on it much until we get to January and February. I do remember that the teacher wasn't the nicest though, so just keep that in mind. Anyways, the rest of the day was pretty normal. Let's move on to Wednesday, August 26th, and talk about my third encore, being art, which was the closest encore to us since it was also in Hall 2. Now, the teacher for art was interesting because she ended up having a baby the following weekend, so we would not see her for the rest of the school year. Instead, we had a substitute take her place who ended up staying a long term. In fact, when Zoe went to the school a couple years after me, this sub was still there, so I think that she took the other teacher's spot. But anyways, the sub was really cool, it was really chill. Whenever we began work on a project, she would get us all to surround her table and do a demo, but then she would let us do our own thing, let us talk to our table, and basically just let us do our own, just as long as we weren't too loud and weren't acting up. On top of that, if we wanted to work on schoolwork for other core classes, she was fine with that. So yeah, really chill and really nice teacher, making art my favorite encore. So yeah, that's all I have to talk about for the first week. It was a huge learning curve since it was the first time I was going to school that was not my old elementary school, but I got through it and even began making friends with those in my class and at recess. So overall, this is still a pretty successful week. Now the next week would be when things started to become normal. We stopped doing these morning assemblies since we kind of had pride in PBS drilled into us, so we were back to normal from there. Additionally, we began working on actual course content. I also began making friends as people around me became interested and talked to me. So things were going well. So let's move on to September. To start, I want to talk about when, as this was when began. So as mentioned, I went to this interpersonal class for Tuesdays and Thursdays to basically better help me with interacting with others. These started on Tuesday, September 1st, and would go on for the rest of the school year. This would actually be the last school year I did these, as 7th grade would be when I found out about my diagnosis, as well as when I didn't really need the interpersonal lessons anymore. But anyways, if you saw part 1, these were just like how they did back in elementary school, just that there were more people. Like I think there were maybe 7 of us, all of us being 6th graders, so it was nice being around others like me since we could all help each other improve and be friends. The teacher was also really cool and really chill. Even though she never explicitly said, if I had to guess, she was likely autistic herself, since I remember her exhibiting a lot of autistic traits, like us having having very specific interests, as well as being really shy like all of us. But she was really cool, and I actually did get better at interacting from others from this class. Now, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I had Win with my English teacher. His Win was really fun because he didn't simply just work on reading. Instead, he made Win more of a fun class that had all of us engaged and actively learning. One cool thing we did in September was a play. So the goal of this exercise was to basically introduce us to how court cases work. So what we did was that we did a play of a court case regarding the 3 little pigs. Now you've all heard the story probably about 1,000 times, but you've probably heard a different plots of the story. But for this play, we basically pretended that the pig in the straw house and the pig in the stick house both went to the pig in the brick house. The pig in the brick house then boiled water, and when the wolf went down the chimney, he ended up getting 3rd-degree burns from the water. But then this play assumes that the wolf called the police and the pig with the brick house is arrested, and this is her trial. Now, even though it seems like an easy defense, as it was actually made difficult by the fact that the wolf had some valid points, such as claiming that he was just coming to visit, as well as the pig's cookbook being on the page of how to cook wolf meat. So this made things pretty complicated. Now, I was the defense attorney, so my job was of course to be the lawyer for the pig. We had a pretty good defense, with us using the 2 other pigs as witnesses, and claiming that the pig had the right to defend herself against the wolf, which if I was familiar with the law back as I am today, I would have brought up the Second Amendment as well as District of Columbia versus Heller 2008. But of course, I didn't know what either of those were back then, so I couldn't come up with a crazy good legal argument like what you see in practice. Ultimately, we lost as the pig was found guilty, and at the end of the play, she was taken away in handcuffs, which is actually kind of funny to see, even if it meant for us losing the case. Now, our English teacher actually teamed up with the English teacher on the other team on our hall for this exercise. So we did our play on Wednesday, September 16th, while the other class did theirs the next day. My teacher asked my interpersonal teacher if I could skip for this day, which she was cool with, so I got to see the other classes play. In their play, they found the pig innocent, but what made it really memorable was that they then threw the teacher's candy jar and the candy just scattered across the room. Their teacher then became furious, demanding they all pick up the candy and put it back, which was when our class left. So yeah, we got to see this class get scolded by their teacher, so it was definitely worth it. Now let's talk about my first test for math, which we took on Friday, September 4th. This was probably one of the silliest tests I've ever taken. Not because of the test itself, but because of the results. So even though this test was just a review of 5th grade math, a lot of people did not do well. But not just because they didn't do the math, but because they couldn't do the math, but also because some people had literally no common sense whatsoever on this test. Like many of the questions were split in parts, so you might see like question 10 with a part A, B, and C. And I kid you not, some people thought that these were multiple choice questions and literally circled one of the letters. Like part A might ask you to add 2 numbers, and some students literally circled A despite it being an open response question. And what makes this even dumber is that we did questions like this with multiple parts in class, so I have no idea what some of these people were thinking. Ultimately, out of the 25 students in this class, only 1 student made 100 on this test. That student of course being me. Therefore, my teacher used me to explain some of the questions, which I did, and although she did have to slow me down some since I went pretty quickly, I still did a pretty good job explaining, especially when with being on the spot and all. However, this test ultimately made my teacher realize that I really did not belong in this class. You see, how the class was structured for math where it was that her second block was for her more advanced students, while her third block was for her regular students. Now, although I was qualified to be amongst the advanced students, state policy was that students with disabilities were not allowed in these classes, which I did not understand in the slightest. Like, how the fuck does me having autism affect my ability to do more challenging work? In fact, me being autistic should actually be the reason why I should be put in advanced math classes, since a lot of us autistic people are like amazing at math, myself included. However, her class was quote unquote officially an advanced class. It was not like officially an advanced class. It was just how she and her teacher organized the class in order for them to give their students more of a challenge. It wasn't like my 8th grade classes, which I'll touch on in part 4 since that's when the state repealed that stupid and disablest rule. Therefore, switching my class schedule and putting me here was pretty easy to do. And that's what I decided. I was miles ahead of everyone in my current classes, so I'll switch to the advanced math schedule, meaning I would begin having math as my second block and English as my third block. While I was still much farther ahead than even most students in the advanced math schedule, I was still more on par with everyone else and still could be challenged more. So beginning the middle of September, I would begin this new schedule, and this is how my schedule worked for the rest of the school year, which at first I was scared about since I had already made some friends in my old schedule, but I got the hang of the new schedule and made friends in my new classes, so things worked out pretty well. And plus, I still had recess to play with my friends from the old schedule, so I still got to see them. Speaking of recess, let's talk about this kid who made recess really funny. So this kid's name is Jason. Although Jason was a troublemaker, he was a really nice and a really cool guy. Even though he acted up, the teachers still really liked him, and just because he was really nice and really sweet to them, even if he did things that shouldn't be doing, like saying bad words or not doing homework. Anyways, we were playing jackpot, and Jason was the one throwing the football. However, when he threw the ball, Jason would shout "D's nuts" as loud as he could. During this time, the whole "D's nuts" meme was pretty big. Like, everyone was saying it, including me and basically every other 6th grade boy. Sometimes though, Jason would take things further by shouting other things related to, let's just say, male genitalia. Like, he once shouted "flying balls" and "big fat wiener," which, of course, being 11-year-olds, we thought was the funniest thing ever. In fact, even now at 19, I do think these were kind of funny, but not because of what he said or how he said them, but because he did those while completely ignoring our math teacher's orders. You see, our math teacher did not find this as amusing as we did, so she told Jason to stop, but Jason just continued and made it 100 times funnier. He never got in trouble for this since he was still on our teacher's good side, but it was still funny and awesome that he was risking getting in trouble for our amusement. So yeah, Jason, if you're watching this, you're an absolute legend. Another thing I want to touch on is in regards to study hall. So during this time, instead of spending the last 15 minutes of the day doing study hall, we would get as a team to our English teacher's room. So another way our teacher tried to get us to do AR was by introducing us to different book series. This one in particular that he introduced us was a series of unfortunate events, a 13-book series about 3 kids whose wealthy parents die in a fire and they were forced to live with their Count Olaf, a creepy-ass bastard who was after their fortune. The kids consist of a 14-year-old girl who likes to build things, and who Count Olaf has a weird love obsession for, a 12-year-old boy who has just read about any book you can think of, and a baby girl who likes to buy everything that she sees. So during this time, our teacher would read us the first book, but after that, we all could choose to continue the series on our own or we go something else. Ultimately though, the vast majority of us continued the series, since we really liked the first book. I was amongst this group, as I really enjoyed the first book, so from then until December, when I finished the series, I read this series and I enjoyed it a ton. And the best part was that each book was worth a good amount of points, so I was able to use these to easily reach my AR goal, making getting my AR goal really easy. And of course these books are really well written and engaging the whole way through, so that made reading them very easy to do. So yeah, AR was going well since now I was reading a series of unfortunate events. Now the last thing I want to mention before I talk about October is a dance my school had. So this dance was an after-school thing that they held on Friday, September 26th. I did not want to go to this dance since I knew it was going to be really loud and there were going to be a bunch of people. However, Mom forced me to go to this, so I had to go. And it was not fun, just as expected. None of my friends attended, so I stood there in the corner the whole time. It also didn't help that they were playing kids pop remixes rather than the actual songs, so that made it all the more obnoxious. But even though it was a complete failure, I survived and lived to tell the tale. So yeah, that's September. Let's move on to October. Let's talk about that drop-off teacher for the last time, as this would be the month where she did that super petty thing to me. So how this part of the day worked was that we would sit with our study hall, or not our study hall, but just our hall. However, we had to fill in spots, so we couldn't sit where we wanted to, but we were allowed to talk and all that. So that's what I did. I talked to my friend who was sitting behind me, therefore I turned around so I could talk to him. However, I don't know if the drop-off teacher was having a bad day or what her deal was, but she thought that this was completely unacceptable behavior. Apparently, she went on a huge rant a few minutes before I arrived about how she was tired of us turning around and how we needed to be facing forward, which was in and of itself completely petty since we weren't being rude or doing anything wrong by turning around. But of course, not knowing this, I turned around and talked to my friend. This ended up pissing the ever-living shit out of our drop-off teacher, so she came over and raised hell over me while I sat there completely confused. I even asked her what the issue was, but she refused to answer my question and forced me to sit beside her in front of everyone for the rest of the time. Something tells me that she probably wrote more office referrals than all the other teachers combined, as if she gets this angry about a kid turning around, God knows how she feels about a kid talking over her a kid not doing their homework. Like, she might as well have lashed out at me for breathing. Thankfully, she never wrote me up since she did not know my name, but if she did know my name, I'm sure she would have written me up and had the principal shaking his head over another completely unnecessary referral. Ironically enough, this did actually happen, and I'll talk about when we get to May. So yeah, that's a pretty crazy way to start this month. Let's move on to a more lighthearted situation, that being the end of the first quarter. So being the end of the quarter, that meant the quarterly AR and PBIS reward. First, let's talk about AR reward. So my goal, as mentioned, was 17 points. How many points did I get? I got 52, meaning I was not only met my goal, but I tripled it. Once again, a series of unfortunate events made this super easy to do. And of course, because I tripled my goal, that meant that I got to enjoy a pizza party while enjoying some cartoons. So that happened sometime near the end of the month. We all had pizza in our English teacher's room while watching Animaniacs. And for those who have tripled our goal, we got ice cream, so I also got to enjoy some ice cream too. Funnily enough, they didn't do this the following quarters, so they lied to us about those. But those didn't stop me from continuing to read as much as I could, so I still kept reading a ton. Now, the school that also did an AR reward for those who met their goal, but I do not remember what that goal was, so we'll skip over it. But for PBIS reward, while I do not remember it too well either, I do remember it a little better than the AR reward. So the school set up a ton of games in the library for us to mess around with. I believe I bowled with some of my friends the whole time. I think they also served us snacks as well, so yeah. Even though I don't remember much from this reward, it was still a pretty cool reward. But probably the biggest thing that happens at the end of each quarter are grades. Now, the only 3 classes that were counted as grades were science, English, and math. So no grades for art or PE or any other classes. I ended up making all A's, the first time I had done so since first grade, so I was pretty happy. So that brings us to second quarter, which lasts from October to Martin Luther King Jr. weekend in January. This is usually one of the more exciting quarters since this is when all the holidays are. And in the case of 6th grade, this certainly was the case, as quite a bit happened during this time, so let's get to it. First, I should talk about my new AR goal. So my AR goal was now set at 19 points, meaning I needed to get 19 points in order to reach my AR goal. This would not be a permanent goal, as my teacher actually changed it roughly midway through the semester, and I'll explain what happened when we get to December. Another big thing that resulted from the start of the new semester was a change in encores. So starting this quarter, we began having library as our encore instead of iSkills. We would return to iSkills for the 3rd quarter, so it wouldn't be the last of the encore. Now, if you've seen part 1, then you probably know that library was a school favorite. Normally it's not, but because the librarian at my old elementary school was literally the most loved and just the sweetest person ever, library time was a time everyone looked forward to just because we got to see our librarian. Like, library time was on the level of PE and recess just because our library was so awesome. However, library was nowhere near as fun here as it was back in elementary school. The librarian was rude, did not really like her job, and was quite bossy. So yeah, library was no longer enjoyable. But it's not to say that I didn't do anything here, as I did actually learn quite a bit in this encore in both the second quarter and when I had it again for the 4th quarter. For example, when we did library for the 2nd quarter, we spent our time learning how to do research with emphasis on making bibliographies and finding reliable sources and stuff like that. But to be honest, the librarian taught us this in probably the worst way she could have. Rather than doing a short seminar on this topic, which was all that was needed since citing sources isn't too hard, she decided to assign us a quarter-long group research project where we had to research on an assigned group of immigrants and do a talk show video. Yeah, this was not a good way to teach us because rather than properly learning how to cite sources, I just learned about Italian immigrants from the late 1800s and early 1900s, as well as reinforced my hatred for group work. It wouldn't be until 9th grade when I officially learned how to cite sources and all that, which I'll touch on in part 5. Anyways, as stated, this was a group project, so the librarian split each of us into groups. I was in a group with a couple of kids I did not get along with very well, so that made this project all the more difficult to do. We were asked to, of course, do research on immigrants from Italy from 1870 to 1920. The end result was a talk show video where 2 of us pretended to be Italian immigrants and basically said what we got from our research. But for the month of October, all we did for this project was create a Google Doc and state our names, our country, our time period, and some sources we found. Then in November, we actually took notes and wrote a report on our findings. In December, we wrote the note cards for us to read off of in our video, and then we recorded the video in January. So even though this project sucked, it was at least pretty well spread out and we had more than enough time to work on it. So moving on from that, let's talk about math. So in October, we finally finished our ratios and proportions unit. This was a huge unit, so that's why it took like a full quarter to get through it. Anyways, when it comes to end of unit stuff, we had 2 tests for math. A normal end of unit test and a vocabulary test. Yeah, we did vocabulary in math. That might sound really weird, but considering that these tests were practically free 100s, they were worth it. Like our English teacher introduced us to Quizlet to help us study stems, and I applied this tool to math and science for vocabulary, since I also had a vocabulary in those classes. As a result, the definition-based test became super easy, and this one was just like that, with me getting 100 on it and every other vocabulary test I took. As for the other tests, I do not remember what grade on it, but I would assume I'd make 100 on it. One last thing I want to mention for the month of October was a field trip that we went to. So for this field trip, we went to Linville Caverns, which is a cluster of caves over in western North Carolina, kind of in between Asheville and Hendersonville. I don't really remember much that happened, but I just remember them being cool and also feeling really claustrophobic at times. And yeah, that about wraps up October. Not the most eventful month, but November would have a little more going for it, so let's touch on it. So to start, let's talk about a pretty cool exercise we did in my English teacher's WIN. So as stated, our teacher made WIN really fun by doing a lot of interesting activities and engaging us all into the material. For this particular exercise, he decided to work on creative writing with us. So how he did this was that he split the 11 of us into 2 groups. So there was a group of 5 and a group of 6. I was a part of the group of 5, which consisted of me and the 4 other boys. Our English teacher would then join us to make groups even. Our group was to take turns writing the same story. So the first person would start the story, then 3 minutes later, they would give it to the next person who wrote the next part. This would go on until it reached the back of the original person, who would then finish the story. Then once they finished, our teacher read each story to the class. Anyways, I was the one who got to start and finish the story. So being an 11-year-old boy in 2015, my first instinct was to write a story about Minecraft, and that's exactly what I did. I started with the story with a Minecraft player mining in a cave trying to find some diamonds. After a couple minutes, I switched it over to the next person. Now for each person, I'll just simply go ahead and talk about what they wrote rather than combine them all into one so you see which participant wrote which. Anyways, the second person's part was a little more action-packed. The player comes across a creeper, who blows up right in front of his face and puts him to half a heart. However, upon blowing up, that creeper revealed a cluster of 6 diamonds, which, by the way, diamonds were way harder to come by in 2015 than they are today, since back then, the only way you could get them were from mining, desert temples, and nether fortresses, since this was of course before shipwrecks and cities, bastion remnants, and all that stuff, as well as back before caves were absolutely massive. They were also the strongest material in the game, since this was before netherite was added. So for any newer Minecraft players watching this and are confused as to why finding diamonds was like such a big deal back in the day, this is why. So after that, it was the third person's turn. This person being our English teacher. Now, our English teacher did not know anything about Minecraft or really much about video games for that matter, so he struggled immensely with this story. But I do have to give it to him for trying, as he actually started really well by using some imagery and personification on the diamond ore, talk about how shiny they were and all that, which perfectly illustrates the value of diamonds back in the day. But after that, he kind of went downhill by naming the player Arnold and had Arnold do stuff that isn't in Minecraft. Well, not vanilla Minecraft, since there are mods that let you do some of the stuff like Arnold did, like carry torches around and attract dust. But after time was up, our teacher gave it to the next person, who definitely had the best part of the story. So he decided to have Arnold mine back up and participate in a Hunger Games tournament. Now, you'll come to know that I used to be a god at PvP, especially Hunger Games. Like, I had a ton of tricks and strategies up my sleeve that allowed me to win a ton of Hunger Games tournaments back in the day. But due to the stress I get from these, I had to quit playing PvP, and now I usually only play single player, although I do occasionally play Bed Wars from time to time. But nonetheless, having Arnold play Hunger Games was a great idea since it made the story a lot more interesting, especially as a PvPer. Anyways, the fifth person then talked more about the tournament and had the players in the tournament dwindle down to 2, Arnold and some other player. Then it was time for me to finish the story. I started the ending with Arnold remembering the song Hunger Games by Beijing Canadian. If you were into Minecraft during this time, you probably had the lyrics to the song memorized. I did, and even now, I still remember a good majority of these lyrics. Like this song as well as many other Minecraft songs stormed the internet back in the day and were everywhere. In fact, whenever I heard this song, I always wanted my next Hunger Games, so that's why I brought up the song. I'll link it in the description if you'd like to listen to it. Anyways, When Arnold heard it, he then went in and finished his opponent, winning the Hunger Games. And then after I finished, our English teacher went back up in front with our story in his hand and read it to the class. Seems like everyone enjoyed it, as there was some laughter and the class was engaged. However, I have to admit it, the other group had a way better story, and it's all because of the very first line, which read, "In a land far, far away, there was a frog, frog, and a frog." This had me and the rest of the class cracking up, and it was only made better when one of the frogs' names was our English teacher. So yeah, the other group did way better than us, but we all still had a blast with this exercise. Now, moving on, let's talk about science. Well, interestingly, we decided to switch it to social studies for just this quarter. Not sure why, but I guess our teacher decided to do social studies this quarter. Anyways, like when, we also did a really silly exercise in social studies this month. So we were discussing ancient Mesopotamia. We particularly focused on the Code of Hammurabi, the first ever written set of laws. So as a way to discuss how things worked way back when, we were tasked with doing court cases where our teacher pretended to be King Hammurabi, and we were all assigned groups of 4. My group consisted of me, the advisor back from camp, and 2 other boys. We were then assigned a case and a role. Our case dealt with a man accused of burglary. For our roles, I was the defendant, so I was the one accused of breaking into this person's home. We also had one of the boys be the plaintiff, and then the advisor was the plaintiff's attorney while the other one was my attorney. So, we spent a few days preparing for our cases, and then on Friday, November 20th, we did our case. Now, before I talk about our group, I first want to touch on the first group that went, because our trial would take a lot of inspiration from it. Anyways, I don't remember exactly what happened here, but what I do remember is that the defendant decided to use some shark decorations in the classroom as his accessories. Like, there was a shark hat that he wore and also carried 2 sharks with him. This pretty much took all seriousness away from this exercise and set the stage for what the rest of our trials would be like. And by the way, he did not win this case and was sentenced to 6 hours underwater, presumably to drown to death. And after their trial came ours. So I was very prepared for this. The reason is because the plaintiff mentioned that he was going to say that he had Alzheimer's. Therefore, I decided to use this to my advantage and basically stated that he hired me 3 years ago to take care of his home and garden. He tried to deny it, saying that he did not hire me, but he quickly began contradicting himself when he mentioned that he went to play bingo 3 years ago and said he just got back from it. This had everyone in the class laughing, because he really just said that he had been away playing bingo for 3 years. Then came time for our attorneys. Now, let's start with the plaintiff's attorney, which is of course the advisor. So the advisor took inspiration from the group before and decided that he was going to wear a shark hat for this trial, which while all of us had us chuckling, this did kind of make him lose credibility. But luckily for him, my defense wouldn't be much better, as my attorney literally could not come up with a sentence. Like, he was so confused about what was going on and couldn't say anything, so I had to fill in and basically did his role for him. But ultimately, I won the case. But to make things even better, the plaintiff owed me unpaid wages and had to be my slave for 3 years. So yeah, I won big time. So now let's talk about art, because it was here that I drew probably the greatest thing I've ever drawn in my entire life. So every year, our school did this fundraiser where they had students draw a piece of artwork, where they then put on art on things like shirts and coffee mugs and sold them. However, I really have to question why they got everyone who was taking art at the time to participate in this, because not all of us were drawers. I sure am not an artist, so what did I draw? Well, I don't know. Not because I don't remember what I draw, but because I have no idea what the actual fuck I was going for. Like, I kid you not, my drawing looked like a taxi flying right into a large horse's anus while a huge war was being fought underneath the horse. Yeah, this thing was looking so horrible that it was a pure masterpiece. But the best part wasn't even about this. The best part was that there were people who actually bought the merchandise with my art on it. In fact, it was one of the more popular pieces of art purchased. Why the fuck people want to buy artwork of a horse getting its asshole rammed into is beyond me. But at least I got to make money for school, while simultaneously drawing something more influential than the Mona Lisa. This gets me every time. So I think that wraps up November. Let's move on to December. To start, let's talk about finishing a series of unfortunate events. So I read the entirety of the last book called The Inn on December 1st. I'm not going to talk about it because of spoilers, of course, but it's a really good and really sweet end to the series. So I took the AR test on it, and the following day, made 100, and that was that. However, later that day, my English teacher came up and talked to me about AR. So he saw that I was doing really well with AR, so he wanted to increase my goal from 20 to 23 points. After my AR test from earlier that day, I had a total of 46 points from the quarter. Therefore, this AR test ended up being what technically got me from doubling my AR goal. However, I would now need 69 points to triple it rather than 60. And to make things even harder, I needed another book series that I could of course finish this one. Therefore, I decided to pick up Harry Potter, as I read the first book in 5th grade and figured I might as well take on this giant. So my next book ended up being The Chamber of Secrets, and I would read the series for really the rest of the school year, as these books gave out so many points and it was easy to take AR tests to get my goal from one of them. And although I would need to read easier books to increase my average, I read The Chamber of Secrets and Prisoner of Azkaban this month. I took tests for both of them, and that got me to 72 points by the end of the quarter, the most points I'd ever gotten in a single quarter. I also started The Goblet of Fire, which is my personal favorite in the series, but would not finish it until January. I'll talk about it more when we get to third quarter. Speaking of books, let's talk about how this project was going for library. So in November, we of course wrote our report on our findings. In our report, we talked about the immigrants, why they were coming to the United States, what kinds of conditions they were met with, and just a bunch of other stuff. We did that, and while I don't remember much from it, it wasn't very easy since it was 4 of us working on the same report, making things much more tedious and made our report more incohesive overall. But at least once we finished with that, we can move on to the next thing, being our talk show. So during this talk show, we were allowed to use note cards. Therefore, throughout the month of December, me and my group made note cards that included what we were going to say. Then at the beginning of January, we recorded our video and finished our project, which I'll touch on later. So that's really all that happened during December academics-wise. Let's talk about what this month is most known for, Christmas. So our last day of school before Christmas break was December 22nd, which I think was the latest that they've ever gone before starting break. But anyways, for this day, we had a pajama day at school. I didn't bother wearing mine, I just wore my normal clothes, although some people did wear theirs. Anyways, our teachers put all of us in our math teacher's room and we all watched the Polar Express together, which was actually really fun and cool. Normally I'm not a fan of being packed in with a bunch of people, but all of us were in the holiday spirit and we were all really calm and behaved. So it was actually pretty cool to see since you usually don't get this from a group of 6th graders. Our math teacher also made Christmas cookies for all of us. So yeah, this is a nice way to start Christmas break. So now on to Christmas break. This was definitely one of the better Christmas breaks I've had. While Christmas is usually one of the best days of the year, Christmas break is usually not the best time of the year. Everyone is usually pretty stressed out, I have to attend a bunch of family reunions, and it's just a super busy time of the year. But 2015 was an exception, as it was overall a great Christmas break. Nothing really crazy happened and it was tame overall. I also got an iPod Touch for Christmas as well as an iTunes card with it, so I could play BTD5 and listen to music and do all that other stuff that comes with getting an iPod. Then the day after Christmas, we packed our stuff and went to my uncle's house, who lives in Delaware. This is a pretty memorable ride up, as we went at night, so it was really cool seeing Charlotte, Richmond, and Washington DC lit up at night, which we normally didn't see since we usually leave early in the morning. As for what we did, I don't really remember anything that we did. So let's move on to the new year, 2016. I consider 2016, alongside 2018, 2019, and 2021, as one of the best years ever, mostly because of that summer as well as the first half of 7th grade, which was the best school year of my life. I'll touch more on that in part 3. But for now, let's wrap up the second quarter by talking about library. So at the very beginning of the month, we recorded our video and we're officially done with the project. Now for the last week of the quarter, we got to grade each group's project. You see, the librarian was planning to talk to our teacher about making this a social studies grade. However, her attempt to get this was unsuccessful, as our teacher basically told her to go fuck herself and that she was not going to make this part of our grade. She wouldn't be the only Encore teacher to do that, as I'll discuss another teacher who tried this in March as well. Anyways, when it came to grading each other's project, the librarian played our videos for everyone, and we all had a rubric to assess each other's as well as ourselves. This was easy except for our video. You see, I hated my voice at the time. Like, I had to cover my ears just because hearing my voice was super embarrassing. YouTube definitely helped me out with hearing my own voice, as now I don't have a problem while watching my own 2-hour story times. I should also mention that this is a couple months before I hit puberty, so my voice was really high-pitched and really weird. Of course, now that isn't an issue anymore since I'm now a full-grown adult with a deep voice, so my voice is no longer an issue. Anyways, I don't really remember what grade my group received, since it never showed up on a report card. So let's move on and talk about the end of the second quarter, since that ended right before Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. So I actually do not remember what reward we got for AR or PBIS, but I do remember that they didn't do anything or double or triple our goal this quarter. Therefore, I lost a little bit of motivation to read, but I still continued reading. I ultimately did triple my goal for the second quarter, getting 72 points as mentioned earlier, but getting my goal for the third quarter was like the easiest shit ever. I kid you not, I met my goal of 25 points on only the second day of the quarter. I did this by taking the AR test for Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which I had just finished. I made an 85 on it and bam, I had my AR goal. I would then read the Order of the Phoenix, finish it in February, and then double my goal then. That's all I did for this quarter. Anyways, should go without saying that Encore switched as well, being a new quarter. However, this switch worked differently, as instead of just Encore switching, it was 2 of them. So first, I'll talk about switching from art to music, which took place in Hall 1, so you'll come to know that I really like music. Obviously, I'm playing an OST in the background, but when I'm writing these story times, I've always got my AirPods jamming to a Dragon Force or a Sabaton song while writing about some random shit that happened 8 years ago. So yeah, I really like music, especially power metal since those songs give my ears orgasms. However, you'll come to know that I did not like this encore. Not only did we not talk about metal, but our teacher was a bitch. Not as bad as my 3rd grade teacher, but she was still very rude, bossy, and just hated everyone for no reason. Like, you get that she was probably the lowest paid teacher at the whole school, but she didn't have to put her frustrations towards us. Anyways, one thing that made music bad was the beginning. So like warm-ups, like what we had in PE, we also had one in music where we had to sing a song. Our teacher pulled up a YouTube video, played us a song with the lyrics, and we had to sing to it. Of course, these were very age-appropriate songs without much screaming or high-pitched notes, so rather than playing something good, she played the most boring songs ever. And the worst part was that she forced us to sing these. If we didn't, we would not be allowed to do anything else for the rest of the class and would be written up. I'm sure the office got more referrals from our music teacher than any other teacher combined just because of this rule she had in place. Other than the drop-off teacher, she probably wrote up a lot of people as well. Anyways, after that, we did our main thing. So of course, throughout our time in this class, we learned how to play the ukulele. It wasn't that hard of an instrument to learn. We learned how to play a couple frets and chords, and yeah, nothing too memorable to talk about. My grandmother actually bought me a ukulele for my birthday that June, and although I don't play it much anymore, I still occasionally string a few chords on it from time to time, although the only song I could play on it is Smoke on the Water. As for the other encore, that would of course be ice skills. So we were back for round 2, which was a lot more eventful than quarter 1, as our teacher assigned us a quarter-long project like our librarian did. At least this was an individual project that we did completely on the computer, so this made that project a little more bearable. Anyways, for it, we were tasked with creating a website via Google Sites where we had to basically talk about either the San Francisco earthquake of 1916 or some volcano in Hawaii that I forgot the name of. The reason our teacher had us research geological events was because she was intending on getting our teacher to make this part of our science grade, since science resumed for the 3rd quarter as well as the rest of the school year. But just like our librarian's attempt, our teacher did not oblige, so this was never part of our grade. Anyways, I ultimately chose to do mine on the San Francisco earthquake since I know a little more about that than the Hawaii volcano. However, we wouldn't actually work on our website until late February, as our teacher first wanted us to do some assignments regarding the 2 events as well as show us how to find reliable sources. Thankfully, she didn't require us to cite our sources like our librarian did, so we didn't have to mess around with that. But that's all we did in January. We started the process of making our websites in February and wrapped up the project in March. And that about wraps up January. Let's move on to February. This was a super uneventful month, so I won't have much to discuss here. Anyways, to start, let's talk about something I don't really talk about very much: sports. I'm not a sports fan, so I can't talk about sports very often. However, this is a very special time for Charlotte because our football team, being the Panthers, made it to the Super Bowl, as they were on God mode for the whole season and had probably their greatest game ever in the NFC Championships against the Arizona Cardinals. Like, that game was so good that Cam Newton, the quarterback at the time, was getting touchdowns. That's how you know you're having a good game when your quarterback's getting touchdowns. Anyways, we were going up against the Denver Broncos and Anyways, we were going up against the Denver Broncos, and we were all really hyped for this game. But then the Panthers screwed up, and the Broncos ended up winning. So when school began the next day, everyone was pissed off. I don't think anything got done that day since nobody was really in a good mood. I was kind of sour too since I got pretty hyped up for this game myself, and since then, I haven't really had the same interest in football or any sports for that matter. In fact, I didn't even know the Super Bowl would happen this year until I started seeing memes about Philadelphia being a war zone after they lost. And of course, after our English teacher was also upset, although he was flying back from San Francisco that Monday, so we didn't get to talk to him until that Tuesday. Speaking of California, let's go back to iSkills and talk about the website, since this is the month we began building our website. So for whatever reason, I expected this to be a lot more complicated, and surprisingly, this was actually pretty easy since we were doing this on Google Sites. Google Sites is a pretty easy platform to use, so it was easy getting used to all the controls and creating subpages and all that good stuff. So throughout the month, I worked on my website. It's no longer available since it got deleted alongside my school email when I graduated back in 2021, so I can't link it in the description. But from what I remember, it was pretty easy to follow, easy to read, and very simplistic, which is what you want from a website. So yeah, that's all that really happened in February. Let's move on to March, which had a lot more going for it than February. To start, let's stay on the topic of iSkills and talk about finishing our website. So I actually finished mine in February, so I had a couple of days of doing nothing. But then, for the last couple of classes, we had to basically grade each other's websites following a rubric. basically like what we did for library when we watched each other's videos, but this time we just independently analyzed each other's website. I got low scores on mine, but I think that was because the people who analyzed mine were not only people I did not get along with, but they misread the rubric and counted points off on stuff that shouldn't get points off. But it didn't matter anyway since it didn't count towards our actual science grade, but it did suck being graded unfairly. So, roughly a week afterwards, we had a new student. Now, normally I don't talk about new students because they usually don't bring any significance. However, this one was significant, but not in a good way. At first it was good, but it turned bad and resulted in what now is a super hilarious and kind of stupid situation that happened in May. So therefore, I won't mention this kid's name, but for now, just know that he liked Minecraft and other stuff that I did as well, so we became friends pretty quickly. So moving on, let's talk about another field trip we went on. This one, though, was a lot more memorable than the Linville Caverns field trip, because for this field trip, we went to the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta. Even though Atlanta is 2 states away, do keep in mind that I live 30 minutes west of Charlotte, so the access to I-85 is like really easy, and I live literally just 20 minutes away from the South Carolina border. Therefore, this is only a 4-hour ride since we did get into some traffic in Atlanta, since it's practically impossible to not get into traffic on the downtown connector. This field trip was for all 6th graders and took place on March 18th. We didn't spend the night or anything, we just left early in the morning and made it home about 14 hours later. So Dad woke me up around 5 a.m. I didn't have to bring my book bag or anything like that, although I still brought mine to include snacks and my video games. But it was already packed that night before, so all I had to do was put on my usual clothes and then hop in the car. On the way, we stopped at a nearby convenience store and Dad bought me a huge family-sized bag of Doritos, as well as a Coke because we're going to Atlanta and that's where Coca-Cola is based, so it's pretty fitting for the occasion. Now, we had to be at school at around 5:45, although me and Dad made it to 5:30, so I had a little bit of time to wait, which, by the way, for this occasion, we actually all waited in the cafeteria and sat with our teams. And to make things better, the drop-off teacher wasn't doing drop-offs for this field trip, so that made drop-off that morning way better. Anywho, at around 6 o'clock, we began packing the buses. Now, the buses we used for this trips were not the usual school buses. Because of the distance that we were covering, our school rented out 2 coach buses, and I've got to say, these things were sick. We had very comfortable seats, cup holders, portable chargers, and a bunch of screens to play movie. So yeah, the ride to Atlanta was going to be very easy, and of course I was with everyone, which made the ride more enjoyable since everyone cracked jokes and had a blast. This was actually really similar to how our last day before Christmas break worked, where everyone was in the spirit, we were all friendly, we were all having a good time despite being the fact that most of us barely got 3 hours of sleep the night before. Anyways, I also sat beside the new kid. He played Pokemon on his 3DS the whole ride up there, while I played BT5 the whole ride, while we both occasionally joined in on the jokes and laughter with everyone else. As a result, the ride up there and back were really short trips, since they were really fun. However, I do want to focus on one part of the ride up there, and that was passing by the CNN headquarters. Now, I bring this up because throughout the school year, we would often watch CNN Student News, which is basically a 10-minute show they did where they aired news for students. And surprisingly, they usually weren't a whole lot of bias in the show, which is surprising since CNN has a very obvious left-wing bias and is filled with untrue garbage. Even for the political segments, the host for this show, Carl Zeus, did a great job stating both sides and making this student-friendly. By the way, if you remember Carl Zeus, you deserve a veteran's discount. Even though his puns were awful, he was still a super cool host for the show. Anyways, I bring this up because as we passed the CNN headquarters, everyone was trying to impersonate Carl Zeus. Like, some people were trying to mimic his puns, while others were full on trying to mimic his voice. In fact, our teachers got into this as well, as they tried mimicking him too. So yeah, seeing the CNN headquarters was pretty cool since we were all trying to mimic him. Then we reached the aquarium. Now, this was my second time here, as I actually went here back in 2014, which I touched on a little bit in part 1, although I don't remember much from my first time here, but I do remember a lot more from my second trip, so let's get into it. So our teachers pretty much gave us free will to explore the aquarium, as this thing was massive. Like, it's so big that it's the largest aquarium in the Western Hemisphere and the 4th largest aquarium in the world. Yeah, this thing was huge. But our teachers basically assigned us groups and we all explored on our own. My group consisted of me, the new kid, and 3 popular boys. These 3 popular boys were really cool and really nice, and they were also really hilarious at times, so that made exploring the aquarium even better. We basically toured around the whole place, from looking at massive blue whales from a balcony to watching an employee feed dolphins to even watching a massive great white shark swim above us in that moving floor area. We explored everything. In fact, we even got our picture made in front of the blue whale, and that picture got in front of the yearbook, so yeah, we had a blast. After that, we then met up with the other groups and ate lunch. I don't remember what we ate for lunch, so I'll go ahead and skip over to the next thing, which was the dolphin show. So how these work was that the aquarium has dolphin trainers, whose job is it to play with dolphins and to train them to do tricks. And during these shows, we got to see these trainers play and do tricks with dolphins, which was really cool and really entertaining. However, the only problem about these was that these dolphins made huge splashes, so big that they often splashed spectators. So what the aquarium did to solve this is that they distinguished the first 8 rows or so as splash zones, meaning if you were sitting in these rows, you were going to get wet. Then the ones in the back were splash-free zones, meaning you wouldn't get splashed. Me and the new kid decided to sit in the back since we didn't want to get wet, while the other 3 boys in the group sat in the splash zone. And holy shit, these 3 boys got completely soaked and wet by the time the show ended. Like, the dolphins were so energetic and playful that they splashed water all over the boys. The aquarium at least provided towels for them to dry off, but still, I couldn't imagine having to ride home in wet clothes, and that's why I chose to sit in the back. After the dolphin show, we then went over to the aquarium theater and watched a 4D movie. A 4D movie is basically a movie where you not only watch in 3D, but you actually feel the effects. So for example, we watched Happy Feet 1. During the show, whenever ice broke or one of the penguins jumped into the water, we would actually feel some droplets of water and ice fall on us, as well as our seats falling back. Definitely a really cool way to watch a movie. And then after it, we were pretty much done for the day, so we packed up the bus and headed back to school. Now, like what happened when we passed the CNN building, there's also a super funny event that took place, although rather than it being from like us passing by a particular place, it happened right on the bus. So the bus came with a bathroom, so if we really needed to go, we could go. However, we were strongly advised to stay away from this thing because as long as we could because it smelled really bad. Therefore, we mostly avoided it. That is except for one kid, who was one of the popular boys from our group. So this kid decided that he was going to give this bus a laugh by simply going to the bathroom. At first this wasn't really too funny, but then he began poking his head out of the bathroom, and this had all of us cracking. And the best part about it is that he managed to survive his own visit to the bathroom, so he lived to tell the tale. Then about an hour and a half later, we made it back home. By then, it was already on 7:30. We got into a good bit of traffic in Greenville and Spartanburg, so it was a rough drive, but that was fine since we were all having a good time. I believe we were the second bus to arrive, as the third and fourth bus didn't arrive until past 8. Anyways, Dad picked me up, grabbed me up some McDonald's, and then I had the rest of the night to myself. So yeah, this is a fantastic field trip that I consider to be one of the best field trips I went on back when I was in school. It was pretty much perfect, from everyone just being happy and excited to seeing some really cool stuff to that dolphin show to everything really. This is a fantastic trip. The only way that this could have been a better trip was if some fat kid broke the escalator. That unfortunately did not happen. It did at least happen on a future field trip that I'll talk about in part 3, but otherwise, this was a fantastic field trip. So let's go back to academics. I think a good place to start would be math. So a little bit before our field trip, our math teacher got super furious over something really petty and insignificant. So for a homework assignment, we were told to create a division problem involving fractions. However, I ended up missing the part where we had to create a chart with this. I'm not too sure why we had to do a chart, but apparently that was a requirement that had to be made. In fact, I didn't even know we had to make a chart since our homework wasn't even a sheet given to us. Our teacher just verbally said it and didn't even mention the chart. So what happened? Well, basically, if we did not do the homework or if we did not create the chart, we got silent lunch. Roughly 1/3 of the entire team did not do the homework at all, and then half of the team, myself included, did the homework but not the chart, since of course our teacher didn't say that we had to make the chart. As a result, roughly 83% of the entire team was put in silent lunch. Yeah, 83%. That meant that there were only like 10 students who were not in silent lunch in a team of almost 60 people. At this point, our teacher should have realized that she was being way too petty and was taking this way too far. But she didn't, and like any bad teacher, she blamed her students rather than herself. This is all on her because she didn't say that we had to create a chart. But when she said that when we were to create a division problem, she was implying that we were also going to make a chart and somehow expected us to read her mind. Which, as someone who's autistic, I would have never guessed that she wanted us to create a chart, because she never said create a chart. She said create a fucking division problem with fractions. This is why I cannot understand neurotypicals for the life of me. Like, they use all this implied behavior and language, and somehow they read each other's mind. I just don't get it. And by the way, if this happened today, I would have probably sued the school since this was grounds for a lawsuit, because our teacher violated the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which covers autistic and other neurodivergent individuals. Anyways, after lunch, our teachers put everyone out in the hall and had a team meeting, which was actually the only team meeting we had other than the one we had our first day of school. Our English teacher didn't say much, but our math teacher just went on about how we need to start doing our homework and how taking it seriously and all that other bullshit while simultaneously dodging any effort to find her at fault. However, when we went back to class, she pulled me to the side for some reason and wanted to talk to me specifically. I was very confused since I was basically acting like everyone else and it wasn't causing any issues or anything. On top of that, I was pretty much emotionless the whole time. Like, sure, I was upset, but I didn't make any facial expressions, so it was just simply acting like everyone else. But anyways, she basically just said that there wasn't any need for me to be ashamed and I shouldn't feel bad about myself, which confused me a ton, but I was cool with it. And plus, at the end of the day, all of us who did the homework but forgot the chart made an 80, so my grade didn't hurt that much. But looking back on this, I think this might have had to do with my autism condition, as well I didn't know if I was, I was likely the only autistic student on our team. Like in my interpersonal class for WIN, I was the only one on my team that went, and so she may have picked me out of everyone just because of that. Once again, I don't know why, it just happened. Anyways, staying on the topic of math, let's talk about one of those typical tests that we took, where we did problems rather than match terms and definitions. So the reason I'm bringing this one up is because the scores for it were really bad and our teacher blamed us rather than assessing herself. So this test was on our expressions and equations unit, which is basically algebra on a more conceptual basis. Anyways, the scores for it were really bad. The class average was a 65 for ours and a 49 in the other class. So the day after grading them, our teacher spent the entirety of the next class scolding everyone, telling us how bad we did and why we need to take class more seriously. However, her argument was incredibly flawed because this test was given to everyone from all four 6th grade teams, and they all collectively did horrible. In fact, one math teacher from a different class scaled his scores and they were still very low. Therefore, the issue was not the class like what our teacher was claiming it was. It was most likely either the instruction given or the difficulty of the test. The test was pretty difficult. I made a 76 on it, which although was on the higher in the scores, I still found it tough. So although it could have been the test itself, but it also could have been the instruction provided. So for this unit, the math teachers decided to teach us with a hands-on approach, where we created foldables for each lesson. While these were fun to do and made the class more interesting, I think I found myself focusing more on actually doing the foldables rather than learning the math and what they mean. In fact, we did not do these for our next 2 units, and I made 100 on both of those tests for them, so they also could have been the reason we as a grade did not do so well. But the main issue, of course, was our teacher. Once again, just like the division homework, she was putting the blame on the class and not herself. This was when this was very obviously an instructional issue and not a student issue. This is, as I mentioned in part 1 and earlier the story time, what distinguishes a good and a bad teacher. Good teacher would have recognized that there was an external factor that caused low test scores, while a bad teacher assumes that all their students were being lazy and didn't study. So yeah, only more proof that I didn't have the best math teacher and science teacher. Anyways, the next unit we did was geometry. This was way easier than the expressions and equations unit because while we did not beat any extreme demons like we would in Geometry Dash, the material we covered was at least a lot easier and mostly just memorizing. Like instead of doing vocabulary words for this unit, our teacher had us memorize area formulas for different shapes, which were super easy since we were already applying these formulas in class. So these provided much for more free 100s. So now before I wrap up the third quarter, let's talk about a fight that broke out. Now although I'll talk a lot about fights in parts 3 and 4 since they are super common in middle school, fights were not really all that common back in elementary or intermediate school. Like the fight I discussed at the end of part 1 was the only physical fight that happened back when I was in elementary school. And the same is true for this fight, since it was the only fight that happened in 6th grade, but it was still at least a super memorable one. So let's get to it. Now, this fight happened during encores. So, but rather than our English but it happened during our Let's try that again. Now, this fight happened during encores, but not in our encore, but rather our English teacher's first block. So while we had music on this occasion, they had PE. Anyways, my music teacher wanted to give something to the PE teacher, so she chose me since I was kind of ahead on what we were practicing and asked if I would be willing to run an errand for her. I of course told her that I would, and I went over to the gym and handed it to the PE teacher. However, as I was walking out back to the music, I saw 2 boys screaming and shouting at each other. One of them happened to be Jason, which surprised me since although he was a troublemaker, he was a really nice kid. But then things turned physical very quickly as the 2 began tackling each other while everyone, myself included, began circling around them and watching them fight. A few seconds later, the PE teacher screamed about as loud as I've ever heard someone scream. We all then moved out of the way as she came in to break up the fight, in which she took the 2 boys to the office while I went back to music and told literally everyone about it since our music teacher had just let us practice in groups. But shortly afterwards, our teacher came to get us, which was strange because we still had 30 minutes, so we were all really confused. But basically, because fights in intermediate school were so rare, the ones that did happen could cause chaos. Therefore, even though this happened to the other class, our teacher wanted us to stay in our class to cool down and relax us all. She also took our English teacher's class and they joined us. From then until second block, we literally chilled and watched cartoons as a way of cooling us off while our teachers dealt with the two boys, who were both in Pride Academy. They also provided us with snacks too, and the best part was that this worked, as everyone calmed down and the rest of the day went normally. Well, except one kid in math pissed off our teacher so much that he ended up getting sent to Pride Academy himself, but other than that, it was a normal day. And for any elementary or intermediate school teachers watching us, aka mom, try this to calm your students if a fight occurs, because it worked really well for both. It worked well for all of us. Anyways, let's now talk about the end of the third quarter. So I don't really remember the AR reward for this quarter, but I do remember the PBIS reward. What was the PBIS reward? An unannounced dance. Shit, not this thing again. I mean, at least if it went better than the one at the beginning of this year since I had friends and attended this, but still, I would have rather been in the group who did not get their PBIS reward since it was loud, crowded, and just an environment that I absolutely hated. And of course, like with any other new quarter, we also got a new encore, so we wrapped up iSkills and returned to library. This time we did a project that was way better than the one we did the second quarter. For this project, we got to choose if we wanted to do a group or individual project. I think I was the only one who did it individually, but I did that and it worked out super well. For it, we basically had to talk about what our career path we wanted and talk about our dream job. At the time, I wanted to be a video game designer. In fact, I often made concepts for my own video games as a kid and just dreamed about making my own games. Of course, that's not the career path I ultimately chose, as instead I'm looking at pursuing a career in accounting. In fact, if 11-year-old me found out I went to college to study accounting and economics, he would probably have a heart attack. Although he would likely be relieved to hear that these very math-heavy fields these are very math-heavy fields to study. And honestly, I'm glad I'm doing this over game design, since not only is demand for that field very low, but as mentioned, my interest in video games has depleted over the years. Nowadays, I don't really play much video games anymore. But nonetheless, for this project, I talked about the types of stuff that game designers do, their salaries, demand, and other stuff. It pretty much followed the same format as the Italian immigration project, just that I did it individually, and instead of creating videos, we created posters, which was much easier to do. Therefore, I won't touch on this project much again, since it went a lot more smoothly than the Italian immigration one. But knowing that our teacher wouldn't let the librarian count the Italian immigration project for a grade, the librarian didn't bother asking her to make this a grade, so this is just a matter of completing the thing on our own. And yeah, that about wraps up March. Pretty eventful month. Let's move on and talk about a less eventful month, being April. So the only things I have to discuss for this month all took place in math. So this will be the only class I touch on for this month, as April 2016 was a super forgettable month with very little going for it. Anyways, I first want to touch on that test for geometry unit. So as I mentioned already, I made 100 on this test. However, I wasn't the only one who did well, as I think everyone in our class made at least an 80 on this test. As a result, our teacher was a whole lot happier than from our expressions and equations test. After it, we moved on to our last unit, being statistics and probability. Statistics is by far my strongest field of math. I made a 97 in college statistics, and I also offer tutoring for it. I also apply statistical concepts like expected value, standard deviation, and regressions when doing risk assessments on the stock market, which is what's kind of taken over in video games as my main hobby. And even as a 6th grader, I knew that statistics and probability was absolutely one of my stronger fields in math, as I did not struggle at all on this unit and breezed through everything, although I was quite annoyed with drawing a bunch of box and whisker plots over and over again. But alongside having our geometry test and starting our statistics unit, we also did a project. For this project, we as a team decided to make a miniature city. We each were assigned a spot that was either designated as a residential or a business spot. I was assigned a business spot. Therefore, for my building, I decided to build a skyscraper using 2 spaghetti boxes wrapped in wrapping paper. That helped me with the materials and wrapping paper, which didn't take too long, in like a few days. I already had my part of the project completed. Now let's talk about how this compares to everyone else. So my building was the second tallest on the team, but the one that was taller made this really silly. So the tallest one was this really tall residential condo. Like, this kid built this condo was wanting to make a beach condo overlooking the ocean, and yeah, this made this city look really funny because the condo was literally taller than a skyscraper. But nonetheless, it was still a cool project and I made 100 on it. And yeah, that's literally all I have to discuss for April. Let's move on to May, which while there weren't many crazy stuff that happened, the stuff that did happen was super crazy. I think a good place to begin would be to talk about probably the pettiest thing my math teacher did. So before we get to it, we need to talk about me and the new kid. So I began to not really like this kid. He was always super annoying, he was constantly over me and never gave me any breathing room, and I just did not want to be friends with him anymore. This was an interesting place for me to be in, as I had never wanted to end a friendship before, and very seldomly have done so since. Like, the only 2 times I have purposely ended a friendship since this occurred was Feud 2018, which I'll talk about in part 5, and a situation where a new former friend was being a dick. Or a now former friend was being a dick, which I discussed in Storytime 47. Of course, I had only had friends for 3 years up to this point, and while I had gotten the hang of friendships, I was still many years behind others my age in terms of friendship developments. So anyways, on Friday, April 29th, I basically told this kid what I was feeling. I just told him that I didn't want to be friends with him anymore and asked him to stop following me, which while he was understandably upset, he seemed like at least to take it well when he stopped following me around. While I was kind of sad and felt a little guilty, I did feel a little better and basically moved on with my life. Well, I tried to. The next Friday, May 6th, we were at lunch. I was far enough away from this kid to where I wasn't noticing or part of his group, but I was close enough to where I could hear him. He basically began talking to the kid beside him about me and no longer us being friends. I didn't say anything, I just continued minding my own business. But that's when the kid he told got up and went to tell our math teacher and told her. That's when I heard our math teacher scream my name, so I came over. She didn't ask me if I told that boy I didn't want to be his friends, so I shook my head yes. She then furiously went off about how disrespectful was and how she was going to write me up, and as a result, I was placed in silent lunch, all while everyone stared at me and some even laughed. Meanwhile, I just sat there and stared at my food. While I was on the verge of crying, I was more just simply confused about what was going on. Like, I just told this kid I didn't want to be friends with him, and that happened a week ago. What did I do wrong? Anyways, later that day, my teacher emailed my mom letting her know what was happening and told her that I was being written up and all that. Interestingly, my parents were in the mountains and did not come home till that Sunday, so it was Sunday when she and dad saw that email. They of course called me over and I came very scared because I know what they were probably asking about. Now, usually, the punishment for getting written up was a whipping, so I thought that dad was going to get his belt out and hit me. However, when I entered their room, they both just started cracking up. They then told me to sit down and they read me the email, but as they read the email, they could not hold back laughter, which had me a little confused. That's when they revealed to me what was going on. This was quite possibly the dumbest thing anyone could get written up for. I thought that from my teacher's reaction that I had done something completely unspeakable, but turns out she was just so petty that even my parents, who were always super strict about office referrals, got a good laugh and thought that this was ridiculous. They basically told me that while the school might punish me with whatever they choose, they will not punish me at all for this. Although they still did tell me that I should have ended their friendship a little better, but considering I had never been in this situation before, they couldn't even get slightly disappointed at me for this, so they just said that it was more of just a word of advice. Anyways, let's talk about the next day. So I still had silent lunch since my teacher was still incredibly pissed off at me. It only pissed her off more when mom emailed her back all confused as well as sarcastically. So she still hated me and was planning to have me in silent lunch for the rest of the school year. Now let's talk about math. So during math, I was called into the vice principal's office regarding my referral. So I went over there. He greeted me and told me to take a seat, and then began what he wanted to talk about. So he asked me basically what happened, and I just simply told him. Afterwards, he just completely bursted out into laughter. I kinda cracked a smile too, since I knew that this was a completely ridiculous situation. And once he calmed down, he basically said that out of every office referral he's ever had, this was by far the most ridiculous and dumbest thing he's ever seen resulted in a referral. He then talked about his discussion with my teacher to see what punishment I should receive, as he always talks with the teachers about what the most appropriate punishment should be. My teacher insisted on placing me in ISS for 2 days and still doing silent lunch for the rest of the school year, which still confuses me to this day because not only was this a stupid ass situation, but I was never the one to get in trouble. I had all A's and was basically the perfect student in many teachers' eyes. However, the vice principal didn't even want this referral to be put on my record, much less punish me. Because not only was this just a stupid situation to begin with, but if I was given an official punishment, my parents could sue the school for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, as this was a very clear case of discrimination against a student with autism, since I didn't know better or even did anything wrong for that matter. Therefore, he compromised with her and told her that they'll keep the referral on my record, but they will not give me any punishment. Frustrated, she gave in, and that's what they decided to do. And the vice principal told me that the best part was that this only lasted on my record until the end of the school year, as it would not carry over to middle school. So yeah, I did not receive a punishment other than 2 days of silent lunch, as my principal also forced my teacher to stop putting me in silent lunch. I didn't thank them and was dismissed. Now, this situation ultimately turned out for the better for me. After I got my referral, I began treating this thing like a trophy. I showed it to all my friends, and word spread really quickly about what happened. This resulted in me becoming a celebrity across not just our team, but the entire school. Like, people could not believe that I got written up for this, and that was the talk of the school for the rest of the school year. Even the kid I ended my friendship with was amused with this, even telling me that he wished he didn't tell that kid who snitched on me for it. As for the kid who snitched on me, I would stop talking to him too, although I wouldn't directly tell him that I wouldn't be friends with him anymore, since I knew that if I did that again, I'd be written up again. But that kid ended up becoming really unpopular and stayed unpopular since nobody would like snitches, especially when they snitch over something like this. Oh, and just to make things even better, our math teacher did not teach at our school the following year, according to some fellow students. I think this was for this reason, although it could have been something else. I don't know, but I'll just say it was this because that makes it really funny. So yeah, that's how I got an office referral for telling someone I didn't want to be their friend anymore. This was not the only office referral I've ever got while I was in school, and I'm sure glad it was for this, as me, my parents, and my friends continue to joke about this situation to this day just because of how dumb of a situation it was. In fact, this is pretty much my go-to story whenever I want to talk about something funny, alongside that fat kid who broke the escalator in 7th grade. So now let's talk about AR. So for the 4th quarter, I finished Harry Potter, but I didn't do anything special. I just simply reached my goal and picked up The Hunger Games as my next thing to read. However, the part about me picking up The Hunger Games is important to note because our school offered us a reward for scoring 200 points at AR throughout the year. For it, we got to spend time after school and create an edit of us reading a book with a background from the book behind us with the words, "I'm an AR champion." I really did not want to do this, as it just sounded like a super lame way to celebrate 200 points, and I would rather spend my time playing video games. However, Mom forced me to attend this, since we had to get our parents to sign a permission slip that said yes or no, so I ended up doing this. Anyways, the only cool part about this was that they offered us snacks, which consisted of a bag of Doritos and a soda, so I guess that kind of made up for it. But anyways, we got our picture taken of us reading a book over a green screen with a background of it. Then we printed and put in front of the library, which I tried so many times to take down that one of mine, but failed. Overall, this reward sucked and I really wished I skipped out on it. Anyways, let's jump to the end of the year test. So in North Carolina, students from 3rd through 8th grade take end of grade tests called EOGs for English and math. 5th and 8th graders also take a science EOG, which I'll discuss in 5th grade 1 in part 1 and we'll discuss my 8th grade 1 in part 4. Anyways, EOGs are basically the tests that are used to determine how well we know the material and all that stuff. Interestingly, they do not affect our grade in the class, but they are sometimes used to determine if we can be moved up to a grade or be held back. Basically, if we made poor grades throughout the school year, then we needed to rely on good EOGs to be moved up. But since I made all A's throughout the school year, I didn't really need to worry about EOGs screwing me over, but I was still pressured by the school and my parents to do well on them, so I still studied hard for them. Anyways, EOGs are graded on a scale rather than a percentage score. They are graded based on a scale of 1 to 5. Basically, a 1 means you did shit and are well below the state average, a 3 is average and on par with the state, and a 5 means you are farther ahead than most of the state. In 5th grade, I made a 2 in English, 4 in math, and a 5 in science, with a science one being in the top 2% of the state. I made the same scores for English and math in 3rd and 4th grade, but for 6th grade, we're going to see much different results. To start, let's discuss the English EOG. So this EOG went really well, and I actually still remember what was on it today, although I legally am not allowed to talk about the passages in question since that's prohibited by law, even if this test was 7 years ago. However, I can talk about my score, which is what I really want to focus on since it was by far the most memorable part of the test. So as mentioned, I made a 2 on my English EOG 3 years in a row, but this is when that pattern changed, as instead of making another 2, I made a 4. Yeah, in just one school year, I went from being below state average to being above state average. This is a super good feeling, since that's a massive increase in score. And the same thing actually happened in math. So because of how well my teacher organized the material, I knew exactly what to study, and because of that, I made a 5 on this EOG, putting me well above the state average. So this was also made me incredibly happy. Now let's jump over to June. June 2016 was by far the best month of 2016, as well as one of the best months of my life. Like, this month was just all around amazing, had 2 days I consider to be one of the best days of ever. It was an amazing month. I'll only talk about the first half of this month in this story time, as well as the one of the 2 best days ever, as I'll discuss the other half plus the other day in part 3. Anyways, on June 1st, we took the last test of the school year, that being the science final exam. So science for 6th and 7th grade works a little differently because since we don't have EOGs for science in these grades, the state created final exams for these courses, similar to a final exam in college, just that these were created by the state. These differed from EOGs because not only were they percentage-based scores, but they also had less questions. Another interesting thing about these statewide final exams, which were called NCFEs, is that they're no longer administered. The last time they administered these were in 2019. As once COVID-19 hit, they stopped doing these and have not resumed them since. They still do EOGs, but they don't do final exams anymore. But that wouldn't be for another 4 years, so for now, I was still taking them. Anyways, we took our science NCFE on June 1st. The questions were super weirdly worded and I really did not know how to feel after finishing it. But luckily, I did well on it. While I don't remember what grade I made specifically, I believe my teacher said that if this was graded like an EOG, I would have made a 5. So yeah, I could say I made a 2 5s and a 4. That's pretty damn good, especially compared to my EOG from elementary school. And that brings us to end of year activities. Because 2016 was a leap year, our last day of school came sooner, which in our case was Tuesday, June 7th. Normally we don't get out until either the second Friday or June or June 9th, whichever came first. But of course, being leap year, we got out a little sooner. Anyways, let's talk about end of year activities, since quite a bit happened from science NCFE to the last day of school. To start, let's talk about the last day of encores, which we got to see our music teacher just as petty as our math teacher. While she did not write anyone up for ending our friendships, she did threaten to write up the entire class for talking. Listen, it's the end of the year. If you really think that you're gonna get something done, you're not. Just let everyone talk since they aren't gonna pay attention anyways. After that, we went to science, where we watched this movie about a group of students getting to go to space. I don't remember it too well, but I remember that after lunch, we got to make bottle rockets, and then we as a team went outside to shoot them. These were really fun to make and shoot, as while mine did not go very high, it did almost hit someone in the face, which was really funny. Then the next day, June 3rd, we got our yearbooks and got to go outside as an entire grade to hang out and sign each other's books, which I still have mine today and often look through it from time to time. I got a shit ton of signatures in mine, including from both of my teachers. However, what I remember most from this event was actually meeting a new kid, or a new friend. I don't remember how it started, but this kid came up and began talking to me. I talked with him back and we pretty much clicked instantly. Learned that his name was Robbie. He's likely watching a Storytime now since we're still friends today, so Robbie, if you're watching this, hello. Robbie will be somewhat prevalent in part 3, but he's gonna really shine in part 4, so be on the lookout for him when we get there. Anyways, the next day was of course the last weekend before school let out. However, this weekend was a very important weekend for my life because this would be when I officially began swimming competitively. So for a while, Zoe wanted to swim competitively. Ultimately, Mom and Dad gave in and also required that I swim for the summer. I didn't want to, but of course since they were forcing me, I did not have any choice. So that Saturday, June 4th, we did tryouts with the coach of the local team. The coach had been here for a couple of years. He was rather young, but he was really energetic and really loved what he was doing and wanted others to enjoy it too, which is something good coaches usually have. So we did tryouts with me and Zoe, and then while we changed to our dry clothes, he talked with our parents some. I'll talk about our first and second swim practice with this team, which took place that Monday and Tuesday respectively, but I won't touch much on the team very much to story time. But it'll play a big role and set us up for part 3, so I'll talk about it more in detail there. Anyways, let's move on to Monday, June 6th. So for our PBIS reward, we went on a field trip to the YMCA. The YMCA we went to was a lot wealthier than the ones I've been to, and I'll explain why I say that when we get in a bit. Anyways, when we got there, we were split between 5th and 6th graders. So while the 5th graders started with the land activities, us 6th graders got to swim first. So let's talk about that. So this YMCA had an outdoor pool, and this pool had everything. It had a bunch of those water mushroom things, a jungle gym in the water, a big water slide in the deep end, and some 25-yard lanes to race in. So yeah, this pool had everything. Now to enter the pool, or enter the deep end, we first had to do a swim test. For it, we just had to swim a lap without touching the floor. I did this really easily and was able to swim in the deep end, which I spent a lot of my time at. I also got in a splashing war with a girl who I became friends with in 7th grade, although she would move to Virginia like 3/4 of the way through the school year. Anyhow, after pool time was up, we dried off and put our regular clothes on. Because the locker rooms had stalls attached to them, I just changed in a stall rather than out in the open like what everyone else did. In part 1, this was a big issue since I just could never get comfortable changing in a locker room out in front of everyone. Like, some people will talk to each other while changing, but I just cannot do that. Like, I have to have complete privacy. So this at least made changing much easier than when I went to the YMCA in 5th grade. After we got changed, we ate lunch and then began the land activities. I don't remember much of the land activities we did, but I do recall one where the staff member took us to a yoga room and told us 3 riddles. He said that if we solved these 3 riddles, he would get us on ESPN and put us on the news and all this completely bogus stuff. There was this girl in our group who knew all these riddles, so she was able to answer them and absolutely blew the staff member away, claiming that we were going to be on ESPN and we were the smartest people ever. Obviously that didn't ever happen, but it was at least fun to see. So yeah, that was a good field trip and a nice way to celebrate the end of the year. Before I talk about the last day of school, let's talk about that night, which of course was me and my Zoe had our first swim practice. Well, it wasn't really a swim practice the first half of practice because it began thundering. We trained at an indoor pool, so we instead did land exercises. Our coach introduced us to the team and basically just told me and Zoe how things worked. However, my coach also introduced me to this rather shy and somewhat awkward kid. His name was Alex. Alex had been swimming for about a year. He was a grade younger than me, although he was only 6 months younger than me. Alex liked video games, particularly Minecraft, so that automatically made us good friends. He also introduced me to anime, although it'd be a few years before I began watching anime. But nonetheless, Alex was an awesome friend. He would go on to be my first subscriber, and even to this very day, over 7 years later, we were still very best friends. So ultimately, joining the swim team was a really good choice because I got to meet Alex. So that brings me to Tuesday, June 7th, 2016. My last day of 6th grade, my last day at intermediate school, and one of the best days of my life. This day was nothing short of magical and was just such an awesome day. Like alongside April 14th, 2018, the day I got saved, June 23rd, 2018, my last day of Fuge, and December 10th, 2021, my very last day of school, this is a day I often think of whenever I think about the best day of my life. So let's get to it. So to start, let's talk about that morning. So on the last day of school, our school hosts 2 award ceremonies, one for 5th and one for 6th grade. 6th grade had theirs first, so we did ours. Mom came to see mine since I won a couple of awards. Anyways, during this award ceremony, I ended up making another friend. This friend was a boy named Casey. Like Robbie, he was on a different team, but he basically was interested in me and began talking to me and all that stuff. And we clicked really fast. He'll be very prevalent in part 3, so I figured I'd go ahead and introduce him here. Anyways, the first thing they announced was honor roll. For A, B, and A honor roll, they basically called our names and we got to stand up. I was the first person to stand up for A honor roll, so I got to stand up while they called my name. Then once everyone stood up, they all collectively gave us a round of applause. Then they moved on to the other stuff. I got an award for perfect attendance as well as getting 200 AR points. By the way, they also gave an award for the student with the most AR points, and the winner ended up being this girl who scored over 800 points. Yeah, 800. I did the math and determined that she scored around 22 points per week, which is equivalent of roughly 3 regular 250-page books a week. That's just fucking incredible. Like, I don't even know how she had the time to do that. Zoe actually won this prestigious award when she was in 6th grade herself a couple years later, and even she didn't have as much points. I think she had like 600, but still, it's just amazing how she scored that many points. Like, there is no way I would ever been able to do that. Anyways, once all the awards were given, they congratulated all of us, wished us the best of luck for middle school, and then if our parents were there, they could come dismiss us immediately. Mom did that for me, so I got to leave early. Once we got to our van, Mom drove me over to her school. So earlier into the school year, Mom became a teacher's assistant, as she decided that she wanted to pursue education as her next career field. She had a successful career in it, as she became an elementary school teacher a couple years later, and just a couple months ago, she graduated with her master's in elementary education. So she's been very successful with it. Anyways, for the next couple of hours, I got to hang out with her kids. She introduced me to them, and I also got to talk to them about intermediate school. These were 4th graders who were about to go into intermediate school, so I got to basically tell them about how the school works, what kinds of things they'll be doing, and just calm some of their nervousness. After all, I was the perfect person to talk about this since I had just finished 6th grade. So I did that, and they all really liked me. A little while later, my grandmother came over to pick me up. She went to see Zoe's award ceremony, so she came over and picked me up, and then she took us 2 out to eat. We went to this breakfast restaurant, and it was great. Afterwards, she took us home, where we laid around until swim practice. Swim practice wasn't anything too special. I just hung out with Alex and worked on freestyle. But that night was what made this one of the best days ever. So Mom got home shortly later, but she also came home with a Wii U. Basically, at the beginning of the school year, my parents promised me a Wii U if I made all A's. Since I did that, with the lowest grade I made being a 94, they bought me a Wii U. So that evening, I worked on setting it up, and later that night, Dad brought me some chips and soda and told me to enjoy my time, which I absolutely did. I stayed up to 3 a.m. playing Super Mario Maker and had the time of my life. It's hard to really describe the feeling, as it was just so amazing and I was so happy that words can't even describe it. But nonetheless, I was having the time of my life, knowing I would get to spend my summer playing on a new video game console, which was part of the reason why the summer of 2016 was one of the best summers of my life, alongside 2018, 2019, and 2021. And yeah, that was 6th grade. 6th grade was a very important school year for me because this was a big transition in my life. No longer was I still a kid, as now I was beginning to grow up. It wouldn't be until 8th grade when I really saw myself grow, but I still saw myself grow quite a bit this school year. At the beginning, I was so scared about this massive transition, how it was going to fit with everyone, but I was successful and made it through to the end of the school year. Overcoming these types of challenges have always been my biggest strength, as I'm one of those who can get through tough situations and learn from them, allowing me to grow. This happened here as I got through this. That happened here, and as I get through the series, you're going to see this happen a ton. However, 6th grade was also the second most challenging school year I had as a student, with the only harder school year being 8th grade. This was not an easy transition since, as mentioned, I was coming in not knowing anything while everyone else knew each other and the school's format and all that. But of course I made it through, and as a result, not only was the last day of 6th grade super mesmerizing, but the summer of 2016 felt all the more better, and I was able to have one of the best summers I've ever had. So yeah, that's at the end of the story time, as well as part 2 of 8 of the extensive reflection project. I hope you all did enjoy it, and be on the lookout for part 3, which will be on the summer of 2016, as well as my 7th grade school year. That's all I got, and I'll see you all later.